Introduction. The Cold Pull, a Vanguard-Zero Chronicle. History is a curtain. For most of the 20th century, we were told that the space race was a contest of flags and footprints. Political theater acted out in low Earth orbit and the dusty plains of the moon. We were told that Apollo ended in 1972. We were told that the moon was dead, a silent grey graveyard of impact craters and regolith. They lied. The curtain was pulled back in 1983, not by a public press conference, but by a silent, black-budget insertion into the Delporte Crater. This is not the story of NASA's triumph. It is the story of the National Reconnaissance Office's desperation. The Cold Pull documents the classified operational window of Mission Vanguard-Zero, a team of 4 expendable specialists sent to execute the greatest heist in human history. Their target was not a rock sample or a Soviet satellite. It was the architect, a biological entity preserved for eons within the carcass of a 4-kilometer-long derelict starship that had crashed before the first human lung filled with air. This narrative reconstructs the zero-point timeline. The 6 critical hours before the lunar sunrise exposed the operation to the watching eyes of the Soviet Union. It captures the claustrophobic terror of the descent, the crushing weight of ontological shock as human minds tried to process alien geometry, and the surgical brutality of the extraction itself. But beyond the tactical readouts and the fluorine plasma tortures, this is a story about the cost of knowledge. It explores the soft denial of the ship's custodians, silent, faceless watchers who allowed the theft to happen, knowing that the true danger wasn't the extraction, but the possession. We went to the moon to find a weapon to win the Cold War. We returned with a mirror that reflected the oldest secrets of our species. Welcome to the Delporte Crater. Welcome to the Cold Pull. A sub-story of the Apollo 20 archive. Chapter 1, The Vanguard-Zero Protocol. The zero-point descent. The BOIV Acheron did not fly like a lunar module. It didn't drift, it punched through the silence. Inside the cramped, pressurized sphere, the air tasted of copper and recycled sweat, the canned air smell of a mission that didn't officially exist. The protocol, Vanguard-Zero. Mercury's hands danced across a console that would have baffled a NASA engineer. The interface was a hybrid of CRT monitors and black tape tactile switches, powered by an onboard RTG radioisotope thermoelectric generator that hummed with a low-frequency vibration felt in the marrow of the team's bones. Initiating the cold pull sequence, Mercury whispered, his voice straining against the 2G deceleration. Dopamine blockers are live, vitals are slave to the master link. The mission protocol was a masterpiece of Cold War paranoia, acoustic masking. The thrusters used a proprietary gas mixture to minimize the thermal plume, making the descent invisible to Soviet infrared satellites. Neural dampening, each member wore a Faraday cap under their helmet. Thin mesh designed to shield their brains from the rumored psionic leakage of the artifact. The 6-hour hard stop, the lunar sunrise was coming. Once the sun hit their sector, the thermal signature of the Acheron would bloom like a flare. More importantly, the Soviets' Zvezda listening post would rotate into line of sight. If they weren't gone by then, the secret space program would become a third world war. The suiting. As the craft leveled out, the team moved with the practiced, heavy grace of deep-sea divers. Sal and Antimony were already locked into their Mark 12 hardsuits. These weren't the puffy suits of the Apollo missions. They were articulated exoskeletons made of a matte black chromium nickel alloy. The sound of the hydraulic pistons engaging, hiss-clack, filled the cabin. Vitriol stood behind Mercury, his hand heavy on the pilot's shoulder. "Suit up, Mercury. You're drifting," Vitriol commanded. Mercury looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from the G-force, but from the ontological shock. On his monitor, the LiDAR scan of the artifact was rendering. It wasn't a ship, it was a geometry, a jagged, impossible needle of obsidian-like material that seemed to drink the light around it. "It's breathing," Mercury muttered, his pupils blown wide in the hull. "The LiDAR, it's showing a heartbeat that's sensor ghosting," Vitriol snapped, though his own heart rate spiked on the shared HUD. "Focus on the checklist. Seal the neck ring, now." The touchdown. The Acheron settled into the regolith with a bone-jarring thud. The landing struts, designed with experimental memory metal shocks, groaned as they took the weight of the black craft. Then, total silence. The team looked through the narrow, reinforced quartz viewports. They were less than 50 meters from the artifact. Up close, the scale was nauseating. It loomed over them like a fallen god, buried in the dust of a billion years. "My God," Sal whispered over the comms, the professional veneer finally cracking fuselage. "Those aren't rivets. Those are symbols. Look at the check your oxygen," Vitriol barked, his voice the only thing keeping the team anchored to reality. "We are on the clock. 6 hours to find the pilot, or we stay here forever as part of the monument. Depressurizing the airlock in T-60 seconds. The obsidian threshold." The airlock cycled with a violent, mechanical shriek, as the last of the cabin pressure bled into the vacuum. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, pressurized quiet that felt like being buried alive. One by one, the team detached from the umbilical lines. The first step. Vitriol was the first through the hatch. His boots hit the lunar regolith not with a puff of dust, but with a dull vibration that traveled up through the Mark 12's exoskeleton. He didn't look at the stars, he looked at the shadow. The artifact loomed over them, a jagged monolith of non-reflective material that was somehow darker than the space surrounding it. It sat in a crater of its own making, half buried at an angle that suggested a violent, ancient impact. "Mercury, Sal, antimony, on the surface," Vitriol radioed. His voice was flat, the Vanguard-Zero training overriding the primal urge to scream. "Maintain 5-meter spacing. Keep your eyes on the ground until your sensors stabilize." The approach. As they trudged toward the craft, the tech inside their suits began to protest. The HUDs flickered with static snow, a phenomenon the mission briefings called the interference. It wasn't electromagnetic, it was something else. Mercury felt it first. To him, the ground felt like it was tilting. Every step toward the artifact felt like walking down a steep incline, despite the level lunar plane. "Boss," Mercury panted, his vitals spiking me. "We're walking vertically. The horizon. It's bending. My inner ear is telling ontological drift," Antimony noted, her voice clinical despite the sweat sheening her forehead inside the helmet. "The artifact is warping the local gravity or your perception of it. Mercury, engage your suit's internal leveler and focus on my lead step. Don't look up." The entry wound. They reached the fuselage, if it could be called that. There were no seams, no bolts, no signs of welding. The surface was a continuous, iridescent black that looked like frozen oil. Near the stern of the craft, a massive rent in the hull gaped open. It wasn't a clean break. The edges of the obsidian-like skin were curled inward, as if the ship had been bitten by a celestial predator. "There's our door," Sal whispered. He raised a gloved hand, the mechanical servos whining. He hesitated before touching the hull. "Thermal sensors are reading -180 degrees Celsius, but the radiation counters are dead silent, not a single Rontian. It's like the ship is eating the background radiation of the universe." "Setting the cold pull beacon," Vitriol announced, slamming a tripod-mounted transmitter into the dust. "This is our tether. If we aren't back at this beacon in 340 minutes, the Acheron auto-launchers to prevent tech seizure by the Soviets will be left in the dark." The descent into the dark. Vitriol switched on his shoulder-mounted high-intensity lamp. The beam cut into the entry wound, but the light didn't bounce back. It seemed to be swallowed by the interior, illuminating only a few feet of a ribbed, organic-looking corridor that spiraled deep into the heart of the ship. "We go in single file," Vitriol commanded. "Mercury, you're on my 6. Antimony, rear guard. Sal, you're our eyes on the structural integrity. If this thing groans, we move." As Mercury stepped over the threshold, the feeling of falling intensified. He wasn't just on the moon anymore. He was stepping into a place where the laws of 1983, the laws of Newton and Einstein, no longer applied. "The pilot is calling," Mercury whispered, so softly the others almost missed it. "What did you say, Mercury?" Vitriol snapped, stopping at the edge of the dark. "I didn't say anything," Mercury replied, his voice trembling. "I thought it was you." The forensic etch. The trek from the Aturan to the entry wound left a trail that would haunt the lunar surface for a billion years. In the vacuum of the moon, there is no wind to sweep away the evidence of a crime. Every tread of their weighted, serrated boots pressed into the silver-grey regolith with permanent, forensic precision. To any future observer, these tracks would look like a heist in progress, the jagged, heavy imprints of a species that didn't belong here, stealing something that wasn't theirs. The trailing gear, the sled. Behind the team, Sal tethered a motorized maglev sled, a piece of classified DARPA hardware that hovered inches above the dust using a low-output repulsion field. It hummed with a nervous, electric whine. On the sled sat the tools of a dark trade, the thermal lance, a compact, fluorine-based cutting torch designed to bite through molecularly dense alloys that would shatter a diamond drill. The black box interface, a lead-lined trunk containing the neural link cradle, a primitive but terrifying array of needle electrodes, and vacuum tubes designed to bridge a human mind with the pilot's remains. The kinetic breaches, small, shaped charge explosives intended to pop internal hatches if the alien ship refused to open. The eye in the sky, Oracle. Back on the Aturan, tucked into the cramped, sweltering upper deck, sat the fifth member of the team, Calcin, Oracle. While the ground team was Vanguard-Zero, Oracle was there tethered to the world of the living. He sat surrounded by reel-to-reel tape recorders and a flickering green oscilloscope. His job was to monitor the biotelemetry and the subspace radio. If a Soviet satellite passed overhead, he would kill the exterior lights. If the team's hearts stopped inside the craft, he was ordered to initiate the scuttle protocol, detonating the Aturan to ensure no US tech remained for the Russians to scavenge. To the team, Oracle was a ghost in their ears. To the Pentagon, he was the man who would pull the trigger on their lives if things went sideways. The paranoia of the expendable. As they reached the lip of the rent in the hull, the paranoia, already sharpened by the cold pull dopamine blockers, began to bleed into their comms. "The hull, it's vibrating under my boots," Sal whispered, checking the torque on his thermal lance. "It's not machinery, it feels like a low-frequency snarl, like we're walking on the back of a sleeping dog." "Focus, Sal," Vitriol snapped, though his hand drifted toward the XM-214 microgun slung across his chest, a weapon that was useless in a vacuum against an alien, yet provided a psychological anchor. They all knew the truth. They were the speculative engineering wing's most expensive assets, but they were still assets. If the artifact decided to digest them, the mission planners back at Groom Lake wouldn't send a rescue. They would just update the blueprints for the next team. "Mercury, get the lance ready," Vitriol commanded. "Pilot won't talk, we're cutting him out of the seat. We're not waiting for an invitation." If the Mercury looked back at the trail of footprints leading to the black craft, in the harsh, slanted light of the approaching lunar dawn, the tracks looked like deep scars. "We're leaving a mark," Mercury said, his voice sounding hollow in the suit. "These footprints are the only thing that says we were ever human. If we die in there, move," Vitriol ordered. The team stepped into the dark. The light of their shoulder lamps hit the interior walls, not metal, but something that looked like petrified muscle, braided with silver fibers. Chapter 2, The Silent Watch. While the dust of the Delporte Crater was still settling beneath the boots of Vanguard-Zero, the real mission was being conducted 300,000 miles away, in a place that didn't appear on any map. The facility, the Blue Cube. Located on a nondescript stretch of land in Sunnyvale, California, the Onizuka Air Force Station, known in the intelligence community simply as the Blue Cube, was the window through which the American Empire watched the stars. The cube was a windowless, turquoise-painted fortress of reinforced concrete, shielded against electromagnetic pulses and surrounded by a double perimeter of electrified fencing. It was the nerve center for the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, and a compartmented wing of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. Inside, the air was chilled to exactly 18 degrees Celsius to protect the massive Cray-1 supercomputers that were in the basement. This was a Special Access Program, SAP environment. To enter the monitoring suite, even the highest-ranking generals had to surrender their watches, wedding rings, and sidearms. The overseers. At the center of the darkened ops room sat Director Silas Vane, a man who had spent the 1970s disappearing Soviet radar installations. Beside him was Dr. Elena Aris, a xenolinguist whose presence here was a tacit admission that the artifact was not a piece of Russian hardware. On the main wall, a massive projection flickered with a green-tinted wireframe of the moon. "Signal check," Vane commanded. His voice was a dry rasp, the result of 3 decades of chain smoking in windowless rooms. "Receiving via moonbounds," a technician replied. "Cheltenham and Sugar Grove are both locked on. We're picking up the Acheron's burst transmissions. They're inside the hull." Vane looked at the biotelemetry. 4 steady pulses, 1 erratic. "Mercury is redlining," Aris noted, her eyes fixed on the heart rate monitor of the team's pilot. "He's experiencing the contact feedback we predicted. We should have spiked his dopamine blockers higher." "We need him sensitive," Vane countered. "A numbrain can't interface. If he breaks, Oracle initiates the scuttle. We lose the team, but we keep the secret." The tactical feed. The communications weren't voice. They were encrypted text bursts translated from the suit's HUD data. On the cubed screens, the words appeared in a stark, blocky font. 2 hours, 14 minutes, and 5 seconds, V0 lead, reached entry point. Hull material unknown. Thermal lance ready. 2 hours, 15 minutes, and 20 seconds, V0 sig, the ship is humming. Frequency 4.5 Hz. It feels like a memory. 2 hours, 15 minutes, and 45 seconds, V0 lead, disregard sig, proceeding to compartment Alpha. "They call it a ship," Aris whispered, more to herself than Vane. "They don't realize they're walking inside a biological processor. They still think it's a vehicle." "I don't care if it's a cathedral or a computer, Doctor," Vane said, leaning forward. "The Soviets have a Lunokhod rover moving at 12 km/h toward the crash site. They'll have a visual in 4 hours. If our boys haven't secured the pilot by then, I want that crater turned into glass." The secret priority. The mission was codenamed the Cold Pull for a reason. It wasn't just a retrieval, it was a heist from time itself. The agency had known about the artifact since 1972, but they had waited until the technology, and the desperation of the Cold War, aligned. The people in this room weren't just monitoring a mission. They were supervising the birth of a new era, or the funeral of the current one. Oracle, Vane spoke into a secure, point-to-point laser link to the lunar lander. Package. Status of the A delay of 2.6 seconds. The speed of light was the only thing Vane couldn't control. "Package is stable, Director," Oracle's voice came back, crackling with static but cold as the vacuum. "But the team, they're starting to talk to things that aren't there. Mercury says the walls are breathing in Morse code." Vane didn't blink. "Tell them to keep moving. The footprints they're leaving are already permanent. Might as well make them mean something." Chapter 3, The Intestinal Deep. The transition from the lunar surface to the interior of the artifact was not merely a change in lighting. It was a fundamental shift in the pressure of reality. As the team moved through the entry wound, the harsh, unidirectional glare of the sun was replaced by a clotted, amethyst-colored luminescence that seemed to bleed directly out of the walls. The non-Euclidean corridor. The space was tight, a red, tubular passage that forced the team into a crouch. The walls were not metal. Under the high-intensity beams of their shoulder lamps, the material looked like fossilized muscle fiber, braided with translucent capillaries that pulsed with a slow, amber light. "It's not a hallway," Sal whispered, his voice trembling in the comms. "It's an esophagus. Look at the floor, there's no dust. 1 billion years on the moon, and the interior is sterile." As they pushed deeper, the physics of the space began to warp. The light, their lamp beams didn't behave. Instead of reflecting off surfaces, the light seemed to bend around the curves of the corridor, as if the gravity inside the craft was strong enough to pull at photons. The sound, every movement, the scrape of a hard suit, the hiss of an oxygen valve, echoed with a 3-second delay, but the echo sounded older, lower in pitch, as if the sound waves were traveling through a medium denser than air. The time continuum. Antimony checked her wrist-mounted chronometer. The digital display was cycling backward, then jumping forward by decades. Lead, we're experiencing temporal dilation. My suit's clock is slave to the Acheron, but the local field is desynchronizing. For every minute we walk, the Earth might be moving through 10. The Great Atrium. The tight tunnel suddenly dilated. The team spilled out into a vast, vaulted chamber that defied the external dimensions of the ship. It was an impossible space, a cathedral of dark, organic geometry that stretched up into a swirling fog of shimmering particles. Mercury, stay with us, Vitriol barked. Eyes on the sled. But Mercury was already gone, not physically, but his mind had drifted. To him, the walls weren't static. He saw the Mona Lisa entity not as a corpse, but as a superposition. Mercury's vision. Through the gold-tinted visor of his helmet, Mercury didn't see a dark room. He saw the golden thread, a shimmering line of data packets connecting the walls to his own neural dampening cap. The walls, he noticed the symbols Sal had mentioned. They weren't etched, they were swimming. They were fluidic logic gates, moving in response to the team's presence. The geometry, he saw the way the floor wasn't flat, but curved into a perfect Fibonacci spiral that led toward the center of the room. The pilot, in the center of the atrium, suspended in a web of silver filaments, was the pilot. It looked like a humanoid, but the skin was a pale, iridescent gray, and the face was locked in a serene, haunting expression that had survived the death of stars. "She's waiting," Mercury whispered. "She's not dead. She's just buffered." Mercury, snap out of it. Vitriol grabbed his shoulder, the metal-on-metal clang echoing through the chamber. "Boss, look at the footprints." Mercury pointed back at the entrance. Behind them, their boot prints in the dark soil of the ship weren't gray. They were glowing white. They weren't just tracks, they were inputs into the ship's system. The artifact was finally aware that the Vanguard-Zero team had arrived. The tactical reality Sal began to deploy the thermal lance. The mechanical hum of the tool felt like a sacrilege in the silence of the atrium. "We have 4 hours and 12 minutes until sunrise," Sal reported, his voice tight. "If we're going to pull the pilot, we need to start cutting the filaments now. But Led, if I cut these, I think the whole room is going to scream." Double quote. Chapter 4, The Sleepless Choir. High above the great atrium, in the shadowed recesses of the Gallery of Whispers, the air did not circulate. It vibrated. Here, the physics of the ship were absolute. There was no decay, no dust, no entropy. There was only the weight. The watchers in the weave. They did not look like soldiers. They looked like extensions of the architecture. Standing in alcoves of ripped bioglass were the custodians. There were 3 of them, towering figures draped in robes that weren't made of fabric, but of a shifting, liquid lattice that mimicked the starry void outside. The faces, they had no eyes. Where a face should be, there was a smooth, porcelain white mask, indented with a single, vertical geometric slit that glowed with a faint, violet pulse. They did not see light, they saw intent. The forms, their limbs were elongated, too many joints for a human frame, resting on the floor with the stillness of statues. Their skin was a matte gray, interwoven with gold circuitry that sat just beneath the surface, throbbing in time with the ship's heartbeat. They were not alive in the biological sense. They were biological software, grown, not born, for a single purpose, to witness the awakening. The disturbance. One of the custodians, the one designated Alpha Prime in the ship's logic, tilted its head. It didn't hear the hiss-clack of the Mark 12 hardsuits below. It felt the violation. To the custodians, the arrival of Vanguard-Zero wasn't a physical intrusion, it was a viral infection. They perceived the humans as jagged, red static, loud, chaotic, and dripping with crude chemical emotions: fear, greed, duty. The sensation, the white glowing footprints Mercury had seen were, to the custodians, like burning cigarettes pressed against skin. Every step the humans took sent a ripple of pain through the ship's neural network. The recognition, they sensed the thermal lance. They didn't know the word for fluorine torch, but they recognized the signature of fire. The intruders had brought the capacity to burn. The silent consensus. The custodians did not speak. They communicated through resonance, a shared telepathic frequency that linked their minds to the ship's core. They have breached the membrane, the resonance hummed. Short lives. Carbon-based, primitive tools. Do we purge? Alpha Prime raised a slender, four-fingered hand. The motion was fluid, like oil moving through water. No, we observe. They turned their faceless masks toward the center of the atrium below. They could see the tiny, clumsy figures of the humans surrounding the pilot's cradle. They saw Sal setting up the lance. They saw Vitriol scanning the shadows with his gun. But their attention fixed on Mercury. The pilot is singing to that one, the resonance noted. His shield is thin. He hears the song. The trap. The custodians knew something the humans did not. The pilot, the entity the humans called the Mona Lisa, was not a prisoner. She was the key, and a key requires a hand to turn it. They had waited 20,000 years for a species arrogant enough to try. In the dark, the custodians shifted, their robes flared, hardening into carapace-like armor. They did not draw weapons, their minds were the weapon. They could manipulate the gravity in the room, collapse the floor, or simply turn the air inside the human's lungs into solid glass. But not yet. They would let the raiders cut the filaments. They would let them think they had won. Because the moment the pilot was disconnected from the ship, the test would begin. Let them touch her. Alpha Prime projected, the violet light in its visor deepening to a blood red. Let us see if they are worthy of the inheritance, or if they are just meat for the recyclers. The custodians settled back into the shadows, invisible to the thermal scans, watching the heist unfold with the terrifying patience of gods. The 20-minute eternity. The checkpoint. Mercury, lock it down. Vitriol's voice was a physical shove. He had grabbed Mercury by the chest harness of his Mark 12 suit, slamming him against the rift wall of the inner sanctum. The impact jarred Mercury's teeth, momentarily breaking the trance. I'm good, lad, Mercury stammered, his eyes darting around the chamber. The geometry. It doesn't scan. Just the. We've been walking for 22 minutes, Vitriol hissed, checking the mission clock covered less than 100 meters. You're the navigator. Stop looking at the art and start looking at the path. We've Mercury's recall, the journey in. As he steadied his breathing, Mercury's mind replayed the impossible trek from the breach to this point. It shouldn't have taken this long. The schematics were linear, but the ship was stretching the distance. Minutes 17, the throat. They had passed through a corridor that contracted rhythmically. The walls were lined with what looked like gills, rows of translucent, vertical fins that flushed with a pale blue fluid as the team passed. Mercury had felt the air pressure change in his suit, a sympathetic reaction to the ship breathing around them. Minutes 8:15, the gallery of the empty. They crossed a bridge over a deep, silent chasm. On either side, alcoves stretched down into the dark. They weren't empty. They held suits, or shells, massive, 8-foot-tall carapaces that looked like armor for giants, hanging limp and grey, waiting for occupants that have died a million years ago. Minutes 16:22, the time shear. This was where Mercury almost broke. The radiation counter on his wrist didn't tick up, it ticked sideways. The shadows of the team moved a split second before they did. He saw Sal stumble, then saw Sal take the step that caused the stumble. Cause and effect were drifting apart. It's not a ship, Mercury whispered to Vitriol, the realization terrifying him. We're walking through a tomb. It's a mausoleum. It's a salvage yard, Vitriol corrected, shoving him back toward the center of the room. We're here for the hood ornament. Move. And the sleeping king. They reached the dais. The room opened up into a perfect sphere, the walls lined with hexagonal cells that glowed softly. In the center, suspended not in a chair but standing upright in a pillar of amber-colored bioglass, was the pilot. The male entity. He was breathtaking. He was not human, but he was the archetype of everything humanity aspired to be. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his physique lean and corded with muscle that looked carved from marble. The face, it was severe, noble, a patrician visage with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, eyes closed in a command of silence rather than sleep. He looked like a sleeping king from a myth that hadn't been written yet. The adornment, he wore no space suit. A lattice of silver mesh clung to his torso, pulsating faintly. Around his forehead was a band of black metal, a crown or an interface device. Target acquired, Sal reported, his voice hushed. The Prometheus entity, male, vital signs are non-existent, but the bio readings are chaotic. It's like he's paused between heartbeats. The barrier. He's sealed, Antimony noted, running her scanner over the amber pillar. This isn't glass, it's a stasis field made solid. If we break this, we might age him 10,000 years in a second. We have orders, Vitriol said, raising his weapon to cover the dark upper galleries. Open. Controlled burn. Crack it the cut. Sal fired the thermal lance. The blue-white tongue of plasma lashed out, striking the amber surface. Instead of melting, the barrier sang. A low, baritone vibration hummed through the floorboards, rattling the tools on the maglev's lead. Minute 23, the lance began to bite. The amber material turned to a golden vapor that didn't disperse, it clung to the floor like dry ice. The struggle, it's healing itself, Sal shouted over the roar of the torch. Every inch I cut, it tries to fuse back together. It knows we're here. Mercury's witness. Mercury stood by the neural link cradle, watching the sparks fly. He felt a profound sense of trespass. As the cut deepened, he saw the pilot's brow twitch, a microscopic movement. He's not asleep, Mercury realized, the thought hitting him like a physical blow. He's waiting for us to make a mistake. Faster, Sal, Vitriol barked, sensing the change in the room's pressure. The lights, look at the lights. The soft amber glow of the room was shifting. The hexagonal cells on the walls began to cycle rapidly through the color spectrum. Red, violet, black, red. Breaching in 3, 2. Sal gritted his teeth, pushing the lance to maximum output. Crack. The sound was like a thunderclap in a library. The bioglass shattered, not into shards, but into a fine, glittering mist. The pilot slumped forward, held up only by the silver mesh cables attached to his spine. The barrier was down. The king was exposed. And for the first time in eons, the air of the ship touched his skin. Get the cradle on him, Vitriol shouted. Before he wakes up. Mercury moved, but his hands felt heavy. He was staring at the pilot's closed eyes, terrified that at any moment, they would snap open and reveal a universe of judgment. Chapter 6, The Crown of Thorns. The Vault of Heavens. As the mist from the shattered bioglass settled, the team finally looked up. The ceiling of the spherical chamber wasn't solid. It was a transparent, crystalline dome that looked out into the void. But the view broke their minds. Outside, the universe had gone mad. Through the dome, the stars weren't static points of light, they were streaks. The Earth, hanging in the black sky, was spinning like a coin on a table, the continents blurring into a smear of blue and white. The shadows in the crater outside were lengthening and shortening in rapid, strobe light flickers. Time dilation, Antimony whispered, clutching the medical scanner. Inside this field, we're moving at a crawl. Outside, days are passing in minutes. If we don't leave soon, we'll come out to a world that's forgotten us. The shadows in the rafters. High above, in the shadowed ribs of the cathedral-like ceiling, something moved. It wasn't mechanical, it was fluid. Mercury, kneeling by the pilot's feet to prep the neural link, caught the movement in his peripheral vision. He saw 3 distinct distortions, like heat haze in the shape of prowling predators. They moved with a feline, sinuous grace, leaping from one architectural strut to another without sound, without weight. Ghost cats, Mercury's mind supplied the image, his brain scrambling to categorize the impossible geometry of the custodians. They weren't attacking, they were circling, herding us. Lead, Mercury hissed, his voice trembling. "We are not alone. High 6, movement." Vitriol snapped his microgun upward, the laser sight sweeping the dark arches. "I don't see anything." "They're there," Mercury insisted. "They're watching the extraction. They want us to touch him." The interface. Sal and Vitriol ignored the ghosts. They had a job to do. Attaching the cradle, Sal announced. He lifted the heavy, lead-lined collar of the neural interface. It looked crude and barbaric against the divine elegance of the pilot's skin, a mess of copper wires and vacuum tubes clamped around the neck of a sleeping god. "Connecting the crown," Sal said. He pressed the needle electrodes into the pilot's temples. The pilot didn't bleed. A pulse of silver light shot through the wires, traveling down the cable to the black box on the sled. "We have signal," Sal shouted. "Harmony. I'm recording everything. It's not binary. It's a song. The data stream is a choral." The pilot's chest heaved, a single, shuddering breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. The red eye. Location, Zvezda Control Center, Moscow. Time, now, relative to Earth Standard Time. General Arkady Volkov stood before a bank of flickering monochrome monitors, a cigarette burning down to the filter in his fingers. The room was thick with smoke and the smell of desperate ambition. "Satellite Cosmos 1443 is entering the Delporte sector," a technician called out, cycling. "Infrared is hot." Cameras are the grainy image on the main screen slewed sideways as the satellite adjusted its orbit, the jagged, white landscape of the moon scrolled by in silence. "Magnify Sector 4, Volkov commanded. "Show me the anomaly." The screen flickered, resolving into a blurry, high-contrast image of the crater. There, unmistakable against the grey dust, was the heat bloom of the U.S. lander Acheron. There, Volkov pointed, ash falling from his cigarette, the doorstep. "The Americans. They are parked right on the lander guy." The camera zoomed in further. The resolution was poor, but they could make out the silhouette of the Acheron. And inside that tiny black speck, they knew a man was waiting. Oracle, the mission warden, sat in the pilot's seat of the Acheron. On his console, a red light began to strobe, warning, Soviet overflight detected. He watched the timer counting down. His hand hovered over a covered switch guarded by a key, the scuttle switch. If the Soviets hailed him, or if the team didn't return in the next relative hour, his orders were clear. He wasn't supposed to fly home. He was supposed to turn the Acheron, and the evidence, into an expanding cloud of shrapnel. "I see you, Ivan," Oracle whispered to the ceiling of the craft, sweating in his flight suit. "Your move." "Make back in the Moscow control room?" General Volkov smiled, a cold, wolfish expression. "They are trapped," Volkov said. "The sun is rising. Send the order to the Lunokhod rover. Intercept course. I want to see what they are stealing." Double quote. Chapter 7, The Waking and the Architects. The interior, the hand of the king. The chamber did not explode. It did not shake. The terror was far more intimate. As Sal tightened the neural clamps on the pilot's temples, the entity's right hand, previously hanging limp in the zero-gravity, slowly, deliberately closed into a fist. "Movement," Antimony screamed, backing away, her medical scanner clattering to the deck. "He's motor active. The sedative isn't working. The team's fracture." Sal, his eyes were glued to the black box interface. The vacuum tubes were glowing a dangerous, blinding white. "I can't throttle the connection. He's not uploading data to us, he's downloading us. He's reading the architecture of the cradle." Vitriol, the team lead, swung his microgun from the shadows in the rafters to the pilot's chest. For the first time, the professional mask slipped. He wasn't looking at a target, he was looking at a superior life form. "Cut the hardline," Vitriol roared. "If he wakes up fully, he'll liquefy our brains through the link. Cut it." Mercury's defection. Mercury didn't move to cut the line. He stood paralyzed at the foot of the dais. Through the golden thread in his mind, he heard a voice, not a sound, but a concept, clear as a bell. "You are children playing with a loaded gun." Mercury fell to his knees, clutching his helmet, cracking over the comms loop, came to steal a crown. He's not angry, Mercury wept, his voice he's disappointed. He knows we're thieves. He knows we Mercury. Get up. Vitriol lunged forward, grabbing Mercury by the handle of his life support pack and hauling him to his feet. He jammed the muzzle of the microgun into Mercury's faceplate. You do your job, or you stay here with him. Reset the dampeners. Now. Mercury, sobbing, fumbled with the dials on the sled, his hands shaking so hard he could barely turn the valves. Above them, the custodians, the ghost cats, descended from the ceiling, their shadowy forms becoming solid, their faceless masks glowing with a predatory violet light. They were done watching. The exterior, the Owl's Nest, Washington, D.C. While the astronauts fought for their souls on the moon, a different kind of war was being managed in a sub-basement of the West Wing, a room known only as the library. Double quote. The air here smelled of expensive mahogany, old paper, and cigar smoke. There were no digital screens, only secure, hardline telephones. The 33rd degree. President Reagan sat in a leather wingback chair, looking uncharacteristically pale. He wasn't the man in charge here. Standing behind him, leaning against a fireplace carved with the motif of a great horned owl, were two men in dark suits. One was Director Vane, via secure feed. The other was Advisor Cale, a man who wore a ring bearing the double-headed eagle of the 33rd degree, off the Scottish Rite. The team has breached the primary containment, Cale said softly, his voice smooth as oil. The entity is active. Is it hostile? The president asked, looking at the secure teletype printing out the frantic vital signs from the Acheron. Hostility is a human concept, Mr. President, Cale replied, placing a hand on the back of the president's chair. We are not retrieving a soldier. We are retrieving an architect. The technology in that being's mind is the cornerstone of the New World Order we discussed at the Grove last July. The dystopian agenda. Cale walked to a map of the world on the wall. He didn't look at the Soviet Union. He looked at the global grid. The Apollo 20 mission isn't about beating the Russians, Cale continued. It's about what comes after. The entity possesses the cold pull technology, the ability to manipulate zero-point energy. With that pilot in our custody, we don't just win the Cold War, we end the concept of war by making resistance physically impossible. He turned back to the president, his eyes cold and hard. The cremation of care wasn't just a play, sir. It was a promise. We burn a conscience so we can do what is necessary. Tell Vane to secure the package. If the team has to die to bring that pilot back, then they are the sacrifice on the altar. The president swallowed hard, then nodded. Tell them to proceed. Bring him home. Chapter 8, The Passive Judgment. High in the vault of the heavens, the custodians did not descend with swords. They did not fire lasers. They simply ceased to be passive. To the human mind, conditioned by conflict and reaction, their response was terrifying because it was invisible. The will of the mission. The custodians, Alpha Prime, Beta Null, and Gamma Void, held a consensus in the resonance. The intruders believed they were stealing a god. In reality, they were infected carriers taking a virus back to their colony. The seed is planted, Beta Null projected. They have touched the king. The connection is made. Do we intervene? Gamma Void asked, sensing the crude atomic vibration of the thermal lance below. No, Alpha Prime decided. Violence is a crude language. Let them have him. Their possession of the architect will be their undoing. They seek a weapon, they will bring home a mirror. The passive defense. The custodians shifted their strategy from guardians to escorts. They would not stop the humans. They would ensure the humans succeeded, because success was the trap. But they couldn't make it easy. A gift given freely is suspicious. A treasure stolen is valued. So, they initiated the soft denial protocols. The gravity well, the floor of the atrium began to weep gravity. The team felt their weight double, then triple. It wasn't an attack, it was the ship simply increasing its internal density. To the humans, it felt like the hand of God pressing them into the floor. The whispers, the air in the chamber thickened. The acoustic dampening failed. The team began to hear their own heartbeats amplified to deafening levels, mixed with the thoughts of the ship, a cacophony of mathematical equations and sorrowful poetry in a language that predated the solar system. The shadows, the ghost cats, didn't pounce. They simply stood in the doorways, blocking the exits with their presence. They were silent sentinels, forcing the team to push past them, to violate their space, making the humans the aggressors in every interaction. The long afternoon. To the custodians, the 200,000 years since the dawn of Homo sapiens had been a long afternoon. They had watched the fires flicker in the caves, they had seen the first stone circles, they had seen the atomic flashes. They knew this moment was inevitable. The children had finally found the gun in the closet. Let them take him, Alpha Prime signaled, its violet visor dimming to a watchful grey. Let them drag the Titan back to their mud ball. When he wakes up in their cage, they will learn why we kept him asleep. The team's perspective. Below, on the dais, Vitriol was sweating inside his helmet, his muscles screaming against the sudden gravity spike. "They're pinning us down," he grunted, struggling to lift the pilot's arm to secure it to the maglev sled. "It's a gravity weapon." "No," Mercury whispered, staring up at the shadowy figures in the rafters. "They're judging. They're letting us take the rope to hang ourselves. They're not attacking." "Shut up and lift," Vitriol roared, "here before the floor crushes us." "Sal, boost the sled's repulsion field. We have to drag him out of." Sal cranked the power. The sled whined, hovering inches off the deck, carrying the weight of the sleeping king. "We're moving," Sal yelled. "Pass. Exit vector is clear, mostly. The shadows are just watching us." As they began the grueling trek back to the Acheron, dragging their prize through the heavy, weeping air of the ship, the custodians remained motionless. They were the silent witnesses to the crime that would define the next century of human history. They watched, and they waited for the inevitability of consequence. Chapter 9, The Immaculate Transmission. Hemel Hempstead, England, the Summer of Storms, 1970. The summer of 1970 was not remembered for the heat, but for the static. The atmosphere over the Chiltern Hills had become a pressurized capacitor, heavy with a violet, bruising energy that refused to dissipate. In a small, terraced house, two lovers lay together in the dark. They were young, unmarried, and unaware that they were currently the focal point of a suborbital insertion protocol. The man, a computer analyst for Shell Mex, watched the window as the sky outside turned a terrifying, strobe-light purple. The woman clung to him, laughing nervously as the hair on her arms stood straight up. They thought it was just a storm, but the special storms of 1970 were a delivery system. High above the cloud layer, a custodian probe, a sliver of silver light detached from the dormant atlas, hovered in the ionosphere. It wasn't firing a weapon, it was firing a sequence. A beam of focused plasma, disguised as chain lightning, struck the copper lightning rod of the house. The electricity didn't burn the structure. It traveled through the wiring, into the iron bed frame, and into the biology of the lovers. This wasn't a miracle in the biblical sense. It was speculative engineering at the cellular level. A specific genetic coding, an ancient Christ DNA frequency designed to act as a living key for the Atlas, was inseminated into the timeline. The brownouts that followed lasted for weeks. The town's grid groaned under the weight of the energy dump. 9 months later, amidst the lingering static of 1971, a baby boy named Jason was born. He was the blue-eyed dumpling, sleeper agent of the bloodline, carrying the unlock code in his marrow, waiting for the year 2026 to turn the key. Fire Island, New York, The Watcher, 1955. Decades earlier and an ocean away, the first half of the equation was being calibrated. A young boy named Mercury, long before he earned the calcin, was treading water off the coast of Fire Island. The Atlantic was cold, but the summer sun was high. He was swimming with two friends from the neighborhood, serious, quiet boys who belonged to the Jehovah's Witnesses, a group that spoke often of the end times and the sky rolling up like a scroll. "Look," one of the witness boys said, pointing a wet, pale finger at the horizon. Mercury looked. Hovering silently above the water were two metallic discs. They didn't wobble or hum like the sci-fi movies. They sat in the air with absolute, terrifying stability. They were diagnostic orbs, scanning the coastline for a specific biological marker. As the other boys prayed, Mercury felt a strange, cold clarity. He didn't feel fear. He felt recognition. The orbs pulsed once, a silver wink in the daylight, and shot straight up, vanishing into the mesosphere. That afternoon, Mercury sat on the beach towel, listening to his friends talk about Armageddon. He realized then that the end of the world wasn't a fire, it was a departure, and he knew, with a certainty that would drive him into the military and eventually the NRO, that he was meant to be on the flight. Langley, Virginia, The Keyhole Committee, 1974. The slide projector clicked, throwing a grainy, high-contrast image onto the smoke-filled air of the secure briefing room. This was taken by the KH-9 hexagon satellite on a suborbital sweep, the CIA analyst explained, tapping the screen with a laser pointer. The dark side of the moon, Delporte Crater. The men in the room, a mix of NRO directors, Air Force generals, and the early architects of the breakaway civilization, leaned in. The photo showed the undeniable, jagged shadow of the 4-kilometer spire. It's not a rock formation, the analyst continued. Spectroscopy confirms refined alloys. Bioceramic casing, it's a ship, gentlemen, and it's the size of Manhattan. The Russians know, a general grunted, lighting a cigar around that sector for months. Their Zond probes have been sniffing Director Vane, younger then but already possessing the cold, reptilian gaze of the Arch-One's influence, stood up. We cannot let Moscow wake it up. If that thing is what the ancient texts say it is, the chariot of the gods, then whoever holds the keys controls the definition of reality. He looked at the men. We need a crew, not astronauts. We need burglars. We need men who don't exist, flying a ship that doesn't exist, to steal a pilot who has been sleeping since the flood. The plan for Vanguard-Zero was born in the smoke of that room. They began the search for the Atlas-class candidates, men like the swimmer from Fire Island. Unaware that the mission had already been compromised by the lightning storm in Hemel Hempstead, the CIA was planning a heist, but the Atlas was planning a family reunion. The Coherent Light. Langley, Virginia, The Keyhole Committee, 1974. The briefing room was a haze of cigarette smoke and the hum of a slide projector fan. To the generals and analysts gathered around the table, the technology in the room was cutting edge for 1974, but to Director Silas Vane, it was Stone Age theater. Vane stood at the head of the table, holding a small, metallic cylinder in his hand. He pressed a button on its side, and a beam of pure, brilliant red light cut through the smoke, terminating in a perfect, and wavering dot on the projection screen. The room went quiet. The generals stared at the dot, mesmerized. In 1974, lasers were massive, water-cooled beasts housed in university basements, requiring dedicated power lines. They were not devices you could hold in your pocket. They were certainly not commercial office supplies. This is the target, Vane said, the red dot dancing over the jagged shadow of the Atlas spire in the Delporte Crater. General Hayes, a man who had flown bombers in Korea, leaned forward, squinting not at the map, but at Vane's hand. What in God's name is that, Silas? A flashlight. Vane smiled, a thin, practiced expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. He deactivated the beam, slipping the device back into his breast pocket next to his fountain pen. A prototype, General, from the R&D labs at Wright-Patterson. It was a lie, of course. The device was not a product of American ingenuity. It was a crumb of reverse engineering, a trivial manifestation of a technology tree that had been aggressively harvested in secret since 1947. The Roswell-Vatican hybrid. The red beam was the child of two parents. First, the Roswell crash. The debris recovered from the New Mexico desert had provided the initial understanding of solid-state photonics. The humans thought they had invented the transistor and the laser. In reality, they had merely learned to copy the wiring diagrams found in the wreckage of a retrieval drone. Second, and far more potent, was the artifact handed over by Pope Leo XIII in a secret covenant decades prior, The Vatican had held a relic of light in the Apostolic Archive for centuries, a device that could project data directly onto the retina. When the Church realized they could no longer decipher it, they traded it to the Americans, and their hidden masters, for protection against the rising tide of communism. Combined, these relics had powered innovations beyond human comprehension at the time. Vane used this laser pointer not because it was useful, but because it was a subtle flex of dominance. It was a reminder to the men in the room that he walked in a world they were only just beginning to see. The anomaly in the crater, Vane continued, ignoring the general's confusion. It is not rock. It is a vessel, and the technology inside it makes this little light in my pocket look like a flint axe. He looked around the room, feeling the reptilian itch of his disguise. We are going to the moon, gentlemen. Not for rocks, not for flags. We are going for the library. The cold sweat. Langley, Virginia, the sub-level corridor, 1974. Director Silas Vane left the briefing room before the smoke had even cleared, the anachronistic red laser pointer heavy in his breast pocket. He walked quickly, his gait stiff and uneven, the heavy leather soles of his Oxford brogues clapping against the linoleum like hammer strikes. To the generals and the analysts, it looked like the stride of a determined patriot. To Vane, every step was an act of agonizing biological deception. He was sweating, but it wasn't the saline perspiration of a mammal. It was a thick, clear oil that leaked from the pores of his disguising dermis, making his synthetic human skin slide uncomfortably against the scales beneath. The office, the sanctuary of cold. He reached his personal sector, a vault located 3 floors below the deepest official basement of the CIA headquarters. He keyed the lock, a biometric scanner that read not his fingerprint, but the unique thermal signature of his blood. The heavy steel door hissed shut, sealing him in silence. The decor was not that of a bureaucrat. There were no flags, no photos of the president, and no framed degrees. The room was kept at a freezing 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls were lined with slabs of dark, polished basalt imported from the Antarctic interior. On his desk sat a single object, a fossilized trilobite, a reminder of a time when the Earth was quiet, and the masters of the deep ocean ruled without the noise of mammals. The sensation of the suit. Vane collapsed into his chair, and immediately clawed at the laces of his shoes. Torture devices, his inner voice hissed, a sound like dry leaves scraping over stone. He kicked the shoes off. Inside the black silk socks, his feet were not shaped for walking on flat surfaces. His arches were too high, his toes too long and jointed for the narrow toe box of human fashion. He flexed them, feeling the relief of the cartilage popping back into place. The compression of the human suit was becoming harder to bear as the years dragged on. The synthetic flesh felt tight across his brow, itching where his cranial ridges pressed against the mask. The divine intervention. But it wasn't the shoes that made him tremble, it was the frequency. He had felt it during the meeting, a sudden, sharp drop in the local entropy of the room. It was a sensation he hadn't felt for 2,000 years. It was the specific, nauseating vibration of order being injected into a chaotic system. They missed something, Vane rasped, speaking to the empty, freezing room. The storm in England, 4 years ago. It wasn't just weather. He closed his eyes, his vertical pupils dilating behind the human eyelids. He could taste the shift in the timeline. The Vanguard-Zero mission was supposed to be a simple theft, a way to secure the pilot and keep the prison planet under lock and key. But the atmosphere had changed. The loosh, the energy of fear and confusion that his kind fed upon, was thinning. Intervention, he thought, his clawed hands gripping the arms of his leather chair until the leather tore. The architect has left a back door open, a child, a biological key. He looked at the basalt walls, seeing a reflection of a man who didn't exist. He realized then that the heist on the moon was already in danger. The Christ DNA, the frequency of the joyful understanding, had been reseeded via those 2 lovers in Hemel Hempstead. We must accelerate the timeline, Vane hissed, reaching for the red phone that connected directly to the Antarctic command. If the pilot wakes up before we cage him, the disguise is over. The silent Saturn. Vandenberg Air Force Base, SLC-6. The Fog Coast, August 1976. The official history books would record that the Apollo program ended with Apollo 17 in 1972. They would claim the remaining Saturn V rockets were turned into lawn ornaments in Houston and Huntsville. They would lie. At Space Launch Complex 6, Slick 6, on the misty coast of California, the monstrous silhouette of a Saturn V stood shrouded in the heavy Pacific fog. It was painted not in the crisp white and black of the public missions, but in a dull, radar-absorbent olive drab. There were no press stands. There were no cheering crowds. There was only the sound of the ocean, and the mechanical hiss of liquid oxygen venting into the night. The specialist. Inside the white room at the top of the gantry, Mercury stood waiting for the suit technicians to seal his helmet. The boy who had watched the silver discs over Fire Island was gone. In his place stood a physical specimen engineered for the vacuum. At 26 years old, Mercury was 6'2", a wall of lean, dense muscle honed by years of NRO training. But his true lethality wasn't in his biceps, it was in his fingers. He was the team's payload specialist, a title that barely scratched the surface. Mercury was a technological savant, a natural-born hacker who could look at a circuit board and see the logic flow like water. He could interface with anything, from Soviet encryptions to the unknown biological coding of the artifact, with an intuition that bordered on the supernatural. "Comms check, Mercury," the technician said, locking the neck ring. "Reading you 5x5, Mercury replied. His voice was calm, lacking the cowboy bravado of the early astronauts. He wasn't a cowboy, he was an operator. The mission, Apollo 20. He looked at the mission patch on his chest. Apollo 20. To the few hundred people with clearance to know it existed, it was a salvage mission. To the NRO, it was Vanguard-Zero. To Mercury, it was the answer to a question he had asked 20 years ago on a beach. He turned to look at Vitriol and Sal, who were already strapped into the command module. They were the muscle and the command. Mercury was the brain. "Load up, specialist," Vitriol barked over the loop. "The window is closing." Mercury slid into the couch. The interior of the capsule wasn't the clean, sterile NASA gray. It was crammed with non-standard modifications, black boxes with no labels, the neural link trunk, and the port for the laser device Vane had shown them. The secret liftoff D-10 seconds, the launch control officer announced. There was no televised countdown, no Walter Cronkite. "Guidance is internal," Mercury whispered, his fingers dancing over his personal keyboard, syncing the unbowed computer with the launch azimuth. Ignition. The 5 F1 engines at the base of the rocket ignited. The sound was a physical assault, a man-made earthquake that shattered the windows of the support buildings a mile away. The secret Saturn rose slowly from the pad, riding a pillar of fire that turned a foggy Californian night into a blinding, artificial noon. As the G-force slammed Mercury into his seat, he didn't grit his teeth. He smiled. The vibration rattled his bones, but in the chaos of the ascent, he felt that familiar clarity returning. He was leaving the prison planet. He was going to meet the king. The parallax of ghosts. Lunar orbit, the far side, August 1976. The command module of Apollo 20 drifted in the silent, absolute cold of the lunar shadow. Below them, the cratered grey skin of the moon rolled by, monotonous, dead, and beautiful. Inside the craft, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and nervous sweat. Mercury was strapped into the lower equipment bay, his face pressed against the rubber eye guard of a modified iTech optical bar camera. This wasn't the standard Hasselblad used by Armstrong or Aldrin. This was a beast of a lens, stripped from a KH-9 hexagon spy satellite and bolted into the Apollo frame. Target acquisition in 15 seconds, Vitriol's voice crackled over the loop. Delporte sector, the city. Mercury adjusted the focal length. His hands, usually steady as stone, trembled slightly. He wasn't just taking pictures. He was peering into a grave. The superstructure. As the spacecraft crested the rim of the Delporte Crater, the anomaly revealed itself. It wasn't just the 4-kilometer cigar-shaped monolith, the Atlas, that dominated the view. It was the infrastructure around it, a sprawling, geometric lattice of ruins that looked less like buildings, and more like printed circuits etched into the regolith, and in the center, near the bridge of the fallen ship, was the dome. It was a structure of translucent, crystalline material, glowing with a faint, impossible internal light. It looked like a blister on the surface of reality. "Shutter speed is irrelevant," Mercury muttered, reading the impossible telemetry coming off the lens. "The light, it's not moving right." The entanglement principle. Mercury triggered the camera sequence. Click whir, click whir. He didn't know it then, but he wasn't capturing images. He was capturing time. The principle at work was chronophotonic entanglement, a phenomenon unseen on Earth. The atlas in the dome existed in a state of arrested entropy, a deep time field where the flow of seconds had stopped millions of years ago. When a photon, a particle of light, bounced off the dome, it didn't just carry visual data. It picked up the spin of that timeless state. It became a zero-entropy carrier. As those photons slammed into the silver halide emulsion of Mercury's film, they didn't just burn an image. They quantum-locked the film to the object. The chemical crystals in the film became entangled with the stasis field of the ship. The impossible image. "I'm getting artifacting," Mercury reported, frowning, "before I even take the shot. The film, it looks like it's developing through the lens." The dome appeared to be smearing, not a motion blur. The object was stationary, but a causality blur. He was seeing the dome as it was, as it had been, and as it would be, all superimposed in a single frame. To the naked eye, it was a building. To the camera, it was a hole in the universe. The training material. Mercury kept shooting. He documented the breach in the hull, the entry wound he would walk through 7 years later. He photographed the bridge where the sleeping king lay. He had no idea that the rolls of film he was sealing into the lead-lined canister would become the classified Vanguard-Zero Bible. He didn't know that for the next 7 years, he would sit in a dark room at Langley, staring at these exact photos, feeling a strange, magnetic pull in his chest. The entanglement was bidirectional. Every time he looked at the photos in the future, the photos looked back at him, slowly rewriting his neural pathways, preparing his mind for the joyful understanding that awaited him in 1983. "Pass complete," Vitriol announced. "We are losing the angle. Dark side approach." Mercury pulled back from the lens. He rubbed his eyes. For a split second, he saw the afterimage of the dome burned into his retina, not as a ruin, but as a lit beacon. "Did you get it?" Sal asked from the pilot's couch. Mercury patted the magazine of exposed film. The canister felt warm, vibrating with the captured energy of the frozen time. "I got it," Mercury whispered. "Or it got us." Double quote. The static scream. Langley, Virginia, The Cold Sanctuary, September 1976. Director Silas Vane sat hunched over his desk, the basalt surface buried under a chaotic mosaic of high-resolution glossy prints. The air in the room was freezing, but the heat radiating from Vane's mind was palpable. He held a jeweler's loupe to his eye, a heavy brass magnifier, that he pressed almost directly against the surface of a specific 8x10 enlargement. The image. The photo was one of Mercury's shots from the Apollo 20 pass. To a human analyst, it showed the blurred, crystalline structure of the dome in the Delporte Crater. But Vane wasn't looking at the architecture, he was looking at the noise. The quantum entanglement of the film had captured something invisible to the naked eye. Trapped within the grain of the silver halide emulsion were microscopic interference patterns, fractal geometries that weren't shadow, but data. Vane adjusted the focus of the loupe, his reptilian pupil constricting to a pinprick. There, hidden in the glare of the dome, was a sequence of symbols. It was the vital telemetry of the occupant. "They are there still," Vane whispered, his voice a jagged rasp that seemed to crack the freezing air. He moved the loupe frantically to another photo, a shot of the bridge. The same interference pattern, the same heartbeat encoded in the light. The desired status. He dropped the loupe and stood up, his clawed hands gripping the edge of the desk. The data was clear. The pilot, the sleeping king, the entity his kind called the anomaly and the humans would come to call the one, was not dead. He wasn't even decaying. The protocol data displayed in the green confirmed a stage 4 stasis. The pilot was waiting. "He is broadcasting," Vane hissed. "He is not dormant. He is buffering." The computer feed. Vane gathered the photos with frantic, trembling hands. He needed confirmation. His biological eyes were sharp, but he needed the raw processing power of the mainframe, the massive, liquid-cooled supercomputer in the sub-basement that they had built using the Roswell architecture. "I have to feed it," he muttered, shoving the photos into a classified folder. "Read the static. It will give me the timeline." The machine will. He moved toward the door, his mind racing through the calculations of doom. If the pilot was alive, and if he was waking up, then the Vanguard-Zero mission could not be a simple retrieval. The fear. Vane stopped at the heavy steel door. He looked back at the empty desk, at the single photo he had left behind, a wide shot of the moon's horizon. They could not succeed. If the humans brought the one back to Earth, and if he woke up, the farm would be closed. The frequency would shift. The control his kind had maintained for millennia would evaporate like mist in a supernova. "He must not return," Vane said, his voice dropping to a subsonic growl. "Cage. Or he must return." He punched the code into the door, his decision made. The mission would proceed, but the objective had changed. It was no longer a rescue, it was a kidnapping. Chapter 10, The Transfer of Custody. The Great Atrium, Delporte Crater, 1983. On the moon, the mundane world of the sleeping Earth was 1,000,000,000 lifetimes away. The team had reached the Prometheus entity, and the act of moving him from the pillar to the maglev sled was less like a salvage operation, and more like a desecration. The weight of a god. As Sal and Vitriol heaved the pilot's torso, they expected the resistance of dead weight. Instead, the pilot felt buoyant, yet strangely dense, like touching a solid made of pressurized light. His skin was unnervingly warm through their pressurized gloves, a vibrant, living heat that shouldn't exist in a vacuum. His chest was broad, etched with fine, silver-gold filaments that pulsed in a slow, rhythmic crawl, mirroring the song the ship was broadcasting. His face, freed from the bioglass, was terrifying in its perfection. Every line of his patrician features suggested a being that had witnessed the birth of stars, and found it wanting. He's reacting to the touch," Sal gasped, his HUD flickering red. "The suit's sensors are picking up a molecular bond. It's like he's trying to fuse with the sled." The soft denial. The Atlas, the 4-kilometer entity they were currently inside, responded to the theft with its soft protocols. The gravity didn't just increase, it became emotional. A crushing sense of sorrow and ancient exhaustion settled over the team, making their limbs feel like lead. The air thickened with a shimmering haze of chronodust, blurring the exit. The epiphany of Mercury. While Vitriol and Sal struggled with the physical extraction, Mercury, the specialist whose mind had been shaped by the binary logic of his father, and the apocalyptic visions of his youth, hit the threshold of his epiphany. The song of the ship was no longer a noise to be tuned out. To Mercury, it was a high-definition map of the universe. The psionic protection, the Faraday mesh in his helmet, began to feel like a cage, a static fill barrier keeping him from the truth. "Mercury, get the diagnostic link on the sled," Vitriol barked, his voice distorted by the ship's interference. Mercury didn't answer. His hands moved to the seals of his own helmet. "Mercury, what are you doing? Don't." With a hiss of escaping pressure, Mercury unfastened his helmet. In the pressurized, bioorganic atmosphere of the pilot's chamber, he didn't suffocate. He inhaled. The air tasted of ozone, ancient cedar, and data. His blue eyes, wide and luminous, reflected the shimmering amethyst light of the core. He turned away from the team, mesmerized. He wasn't looking at the pilot anymore. He was looking at the deep time mission, the reason they were really here. While the crew was distracted by the physical weight of the king, Mercury began to walk into a jagged, shadowy fissure in the wall behind the throne, a passage that led directly into the Atlas's sentient core. He moved with a fluid grace, his hard suit clanking softly, a man walking into a dream. And from the high galleries, a feline shape, a custodian with the sinuous gait of a panther, slipped down from the ribs of the ship, following him into the dark. "Mercury, come back!" Vitriol lunged, but the soft denial triggered a localized gravity spike, pinning the team lead to the deck. Mercury didn't look back. He was going to the source. He was becoming the witness he was born to be. The 33-minute countdown. The silence of the lunar surface was being torn apart by the frantic, echoing chaos of the Vanguard-Zero comms loop. Inside the Acheron, Oracle stared at the radar sweep, his heart hammering against his ribs. A bright, pulsing blip was rising over the lunar horizon. Cosmos 1443. The Soviet red eye was coming. "Lead, you've got a window of 33 minutes, before that bird is directly overhead with a high-res optical lock," Oracle shouted. "Get the payload to the hatch now. We're moving." Vitriol's voice was a jagged rasp of panic and exertion. "He's compromised. He stripped his suit, Oracle, his vitals just went null. But we've lost Mercury." On Oracle's monitor, the biotelemetry for Mercury hadn't just flatlined, it had vanished, as if the pilot had ceased to exist in the physical plane. The core, the shedding. Deep within the jagged fissure behind the throne, the ruckus of the team faded into a distant, meaningless buzzing. Mercury was no longer a soldier of the NRO. He was a man returning to the elements. He had cast aside the Mark 12 hardsuit like a restrictive skin, followed by the flight suit, until he was naked in the amethyst glow of the Atlas. The air in the core was thick, a bioconductive gel that supported his weight. He didn't feel the cold. He felt the song. As he stepped deeper into the silver fiber nervous system of the ship, a feline custodian stalked inches behind him, its violet eyes fixed on the small of his back. Mercury wasn't dying, he was being integrated. He was the witness he was always meant to be, stepping into the deep time archive to verify the origins of the bloodline. "Mercury, return to the extraction point. That's an order." Vitriol's scream echoed through the chamber, but it was met only by the low, resonant thrum of the ship. "Forget him." Director Vane's voice cut through from the blue cube, cold and final. "Mercury is an acceptable loss. You have the pilot. Get to the Acheron and burn for orbit 32 minutes and counting. Move." Moscow, the GRU Deep Space Command. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of a reel-to-reel tape machine. General Secretary Andropov stood behind a row of seated GRU technicians, his shadow long and thin against the concrete wall. They were staring at a flickering, grainy black and white feed transmitted from the approaching satellite. "There is movement near the anomaly," a technician whispered, adjusting a dial. On the screen, a tiny, insect-like shape, the Acheron, was visible against the stark lunar shadows. Near it, a trail of white, glowing footprints led into the darkness of the crashed monolith. "So," Andropov murmured, the smoke from his cigarette curling into the light of the monitor. "The Americans have finally found the courage to rob the grave." "It is as the rumors suggested, Comrade General," the group chief noted beside him. "The secret they have guarded with sudden endings and vanished scientists for 20 years. The origin of the species isn't in the Rift Valley of Africa. It is laying in the dust of the far side." Andropov nodded slowly. He knew the cost of this knowledge. At the highest levels of the Kremlin and the White House, it was understood that the Martian wars and the lunar artifacts were the only truths that mattered. Everything else was a distraction for the masses. "They think they can take it and slip away in the night," Andropov said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Signal the Zvezda station. If that American craft attempts to lift off with the payload, I want the Lunokhod to target their landing struts. If we cannot have the architect, no one will." The atrium, the heist. Vitriol and Sal ignored the tears in their eyes and the screams of their missing comrade. They hauled the sleeping king onto the maglev sled, the pilot's silver-threaded chest now glowing with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. 31 minutes. Sal screamed, his boots slipping on the glowing white tracks they had made on the way in. They began the sprint for the airlock, dragging the profound weight of a god behind them, while behind them, the core of the ship swallowed Mercury whole, and the Soviet eye in the sky opened wide. The surface sentinels. As Vitriol and Sal hauled the sled through the jagged entry wound, and back onto the silver dust of the regolith, the world outside had changed. The serene, dead landscape was now a chaotic blur of motion. High-speed shadows, darker than the lunar night and moving with a terrifying, non-ballistic fluidity, streaked across the crater floor. These weren't men, and they weren't machines. They were the Sentinels, the surface-tier defense of the Atlas. In the flickering light of the approaching dawn, they appeared as blurs, shapes that the human mind could only categorize through the lens of horror cinema. Contacts. Multiple fast movers. Sal screamed, his head spinning as his HUD failed to lock onto the flickering silhouettes. They're ignoring the gravity. Why aren't they engaging? The team had been briefed that the Sentinels were a surface issue, but they had been lied to about the nature of the defense. They were told their human biological signatures were invisible to the ship's offense protocols due to a cosmic loophole, a technicality in a war spanning the stars. But the real truth was far darker. The mission wasn't a heist from a dead ship, it was a transfer of custody. The prison planet known as Earth was being upgraded, and the team were merely the couriers. The lunar extraction, 22 minutes. Oracle's voice was a jagged spike in their ears. The Soviet satellite is nearly at the zenith. Vitriol, the Lunok head is within 5 kilometers and they've deployed a sensor mast. They can see the Sentinels. Vitriol didn't look up at the shadows blurring past him. He kept his eyes on the Acheron moving. If they don't fire, we don't fire. Treat them like ghosts. Keep a Sentinel blurred past Sal, less than 3 feet away. It didn't strike. It let out a high-frequency pulse that shattered the glass on Sal's wrist-mounted chronometer. The message was clear. You are being allowed to leave. Do not look back. The team reached the base of the lander's ladder. The sleeping king on the sled groaned, his silver-gold chest light now so bright it cast long, distorted shadows of the Sentinels against the crater walls. Package at the lift. Vitriol hammered the remote trigger. The winch began to hum, dragging the god upward toward the black belly of the craft. As the hoist rose, Vitriol looked back toward the monolith. He thought he saw a naked human figure standing at the edge of the breach. Mercury, or what was left of him, watched over by a feline shadow. Goodbye, brother, Vitriol whispered, his voice cracking in a moment of sudden, uncharacteristic grief. He didn't know why he said it. He just knew that the man he had trained with was gone, and the figure on the moon was something else entirely. Engaging primary thrusters in T-180 seconds, Oracle shouted. Strap the king in. We're going home. Groom Lake, Nevada, the heavy water. The re-entry of the Acheron wasn't broadcast. There was no parachute splashdown in the Pacific, no aircraft carrier recovery. The black-budget craft was a lifting body, designed to scream through the atmosphere and glide to a halt on the longest, flattest runway in the world. When the landing gear punched the hard-packed alkali dust of the Groom Lake salt flats, it was 300 hours. The desert was freezing, but the hull of the ship was radiating a heat that turned the surrounding air into a shimmering mirage. The reception committee. As the hydraulic ramp hissed open, the smell of sagebrush and jet fuel flooded the cabin, sensory shock after days of recycled sterile air. Vitriol and Sal stumbled out, their legs jellied by the return of Earth's gravity. They looked like ghosts, their faces grey, their eyes haunted by the things they had seen in the Delporte Crater. Waiting for them wasn't a hero's welcome, it was a quarantine. Dozens of men in full-body biohazard suits, level 4 containment, swarmed the tarmac. They carried Geiger counters, EM field meters, and weapons with no safety catches. They didn't speak to the astronauts. They pushed past them, heading straight for the cargo bay. Secure the perimeter, a voice boomed over the loudspeakers. Light discipline is in effect. A heavy lift forklift, modified with lead shielding, rolled up the ramp. The pilot was still strapped to the maglev sled. As he was brought out into the Nevada night, a gasp rippled through the cordon of soldiers. The pilot was glowing. The silver-gold filaments on his chest were pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat that seemed to sync with the hum of the base's floodlights. The air around him crackled with static electricity. Dust motes danced in complex geometric patterns near his skin. Director Vane stood on the observation deck of Hangar 18. He watched through thermal binoculars. To his reptilian eyes, the pilot wasn't just glowing, he was screaming in the infrared spectrum. "He's awake," Vane whispered, his clawed hand tightening on the railing as to put him in the jar. "He's just waiting for the descent." The sled was loaded onto a flatbed truck and rushed toward the south ramp, the entrance to the deep underground facility known as S4. The elevator ride down took 5 minutes. They descended past the conventional labs, past the red light hangar where the captured discs were kept, down to level 9, the Omega lab. Here, the walls were lined with copper Faraday cages. The air was pressurized and chilled. A massive, cylindrical tank filled with a viscous, amber liquid, an amniotic suspension fluid derived from the Roswell biology, stood in the center of the room. "Get him in, now," the lead scientist shouted, his voice cracking with panic spiking. "He's trying to interface with the grid." His biofield as it took 6 men to lift the pilot. He was dense, heavier than lead. As they lowered him into the fluid, the pilot's eyes fluttered. For a second, the amber liquid boiled. Then, the stasis field engaged. The glow on his chest dimmed to a faint thrum. The thick glass doors of the Omega lab hissed shut, sealing the king in his tomb. Up on the surface, Vitriol sat on the edge of the tarmac, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. He looked up at the moon, which hung fat and yellow over the mountains. "We shouldn't have brought him back," Sal whispered, sitting beside him. "Lead. We just moved the bomb to our own basement. We didn't rescue him." Vitriol flicked his cigarette into the dark. "It's not our problem anymore, Sal. It's the future's problem." Double quote. Chapter 11, The Resonance of the Void. The Great Atrium, Delporte Crater, 1983. The extraction was a blur of panic and shouting, a chaotic scramble of men trying to drag a god across a finish line. But for Mercury, the world had slowed to a crystalline standstill. Behind him, the maglev sled scraped violently against the deck. He heard Vitriol screaming his name over the comms loop, a jagged, desperate sound that felt small and distant, like a radio playing in another room. Mercury stopped. He didn't turn to look at the exit. He didn't look at the team retreating toward the Acheron. He turned his back on them. He turned his back on the NRO, on the mission, and on the species that had sent him here. The awakening. The song hit him then. It wasn't a sound his ears could hear. It was a vibration that resonated in the marrow of his bones. It was a frequency of pure acknowledgement. For 30 years, Mercury had felt like a stranger in his own skin, a man wearing a costume, pretending to understand the binary logic of Earth. Now, the pretense evaporated. The call he had felt as a boy swimming off Fire Island, the clarity he had felt looking through the lens of Apollo 20, it all converged on this single coordinate. "I am not being left behind," he realized, a flush of euphoric heat flooding his chest. "I am arriving." The shedding. He looked down at his gloved hands. The Mark 12 hardsuit, a masterpiece of human engineering designed to keep the vacuum out, suddenly felt disgusting. It was heavy, stifling, and dead. It was a coffin he was walking around in. Pure undoing. The thought was a command. Mercury reached up and grabbed the locking collar of his helmet. "Mercury, don't." Vitriol's voice was a ghost in his ear. Mercury twisted the ring. His clack. He pulled the helmet off and let it drop. It didn't hit the floor, it floated away, caught in the ship's rising gravity tide. The breath of life. He expected the cold vacuum or the metallic taste of recycled air. Instead, he was hit by a wall of life. It rushed into his nose and mouth, a dense, intoxicating perfume of sweet, crystallized pine and the sharp, sticky warmth of cannabis resins. It wasn't the smell of burning, but the smell of the living plant in its most potent, concentrated form. It smelled of sap, of deep forests, of things growing in the dark. He gasped, drinking deeply. The air wasn't gas, it was food. It was a natural aerosol of nutrients, a thick, rich vapor that coated his throat and filled his lungs with cool fire. It was the freshest thing he had ever tasted. It was the purest breath he had ever taken. Every cell in his body seemed to snap open, hungry and grateful. The fatigue of the mission, the fear, the radiation damage from the flight, it was all scrubbed away by the vitality of the atmosphere. He wasn't just breathing, he was being refueled. The shield of chaos. He stripped the rest of the armor off with frantic, Joyful movements. The gloves, the chest plate, the boots. He shed the layers of the payload specialist until he stood naked in the amethyst light, his skin drinking in the resinous air. Behind him, the ship responded to his undressing. The chaotic energy that was terrifying the extraction team, the localized gravity spikes, the shifting shadows, coalesced around Mercury. To Vitriol and Sal, it looked like the ship was swallowing him. To Mercury, the ship was shielding him. The gravity waves formed a protective cocoon, blocking the view of the retreating team, cutting the visual cord between his past and his future. He stood up. He realized he had been slouching his whole life, weighed down by the gravity of Earth. Now, he stood to his full height, his spine elongating, his muscles relaxing into the perfect equilibrium of the ship's environment. The source. A shadow detached itself from the high ribs of the cathedral ceiling. A custodian, sinuous, feline, and blacker than the void, landed silently beside him. It didn't attack. It rubbed its flank against his leg, purring with the sound of a high-voltage transformer. Mercury looked ahead, into the jagged fissure behind the empty throne. The song was loudest there. It was a choir of data, singing the history of the galaxy. He took the first step away from humanity, breathing in the sweet, pine-rich life of the machine. The darkness swallowed him, and for the first time in his life, Mercury saw everything. The chrysalis. The Inner Sanctum, 1983. The feline custodian did not wait for Mercury to get his bearings. With a liquid ripple of its obsidian muscles, it turned and padded deeper into the shadows, its violet eyes looking back with an expectant intelligence. It let out a chirp, a sound like a modem handshaking with a bird, and Mercury followed. He didn't walk, he glided. The gravity in the core was lighter, tuned to the specific density of the ship's original inhabitants. The sick bay, the loom. The cat led him into a small, spherical chamber lined with what looked like white coral. This wasn't a medical bay in the sterile, terrifying human sense. There were no needles, no stainless steel tables. It was the bioloom. The air here was even richer, heavy with the golden mist of the pine resin nutrients. As Mercury stepped into the center of the room, the walls pulsed. A cone of sonic vibration descended over him. It wasn't painful. It felt like a warm shiver moving through his atoms. Instant purification. Mercury watched in awe as a gray, tar-like substance seeped out of his pores and evaporated instantly into the mist. It was the toxin of Earth, the microplastics, the heavy metals from the NRO water supply, the background radiation from the flight, the cortisol of 30 years of fear. It was all vibrated out of his cells. His skin flushed. The scars on his knuckles from basic training smoothed over. The gray in his stubble turned back to gold. He felt lighter, cleaner, and stronger than any human being had a right to feel. He was no longer just biological, he was being rewoven. The viewing dome. The cat nudged his leg again, urgent now. It trotted toward a massive, curved aperture in the hull, a viewing dome that looked out over the crater floor. Mercury stepped up to the glass. Outside, the laws of physics seemed to have held their breath. Time stood completely still. It wasn't a metaphor. The chronofield of the ship had dilated the moment to a perfect, crystalline halt. Mercury could see the dust motes hanging suspended over the regolith. He could see the Aturan on the landing pad, its thrusters firing in a silent, frozen explosion of orange flame. And he saw them. The glimpse. 500 yards away, at the base of the lander's lift, Vitriol and Sal were frozen in mid-sprint. They were hauling the glowing sled of the pilot. Because of the time dilation, Mercury could see everything with impossible clarity. He saw the sweat on Vitriol's brow, the terror in Sal's eyes. He saw the scratch on the lander's strut. And then, as if sensing the gaze of a god, Vitriol's head turned. In the reality of the extraction team, it was a split-second blur, but in Mercury's reality, the connection was infinite. Vitriol looked up at the breach in the hull. He didn't see the dying, suffocating man he thought he had left behind. He saw Mercury. He saw a man standing tall and proud, flanked by a black panther. Mercury's skin was glistening, not with sweat, but with a pearlescent, iridescent sheen, as if he had just emerged from a pool of living mercury. He radiated health. He radiated power. Mercury placed a glistening hand against the glass of the dome. He didn't wave goodbye, he simply stood witness. "I am clean, brother," Mercury projected, though he didn't speak. "Go home. I have the watch." The release. The moment broke. Time snapped back into forward motion. On the surface, the Acheron's thrusters roared to life, kicking up a storm of dust that obscured the view. The lander shot upward, fleeing the ghosts of the crater. Mercury watched them go until they were just a star moving against the black. He lowered his hand. The cat purred, weaving between his legs. The human part of him was gone. The witness had begun his shift. Chapter 12, The Parliament of Owls. The White House. The Black Library, October 1983. The room did not exist on the blueprints of the executive mansion. Located 3 levels beneath the East Wing, accessed only by a retinal scanner calibrated to the bloodlines of the 33rd degree. It was known to the few who entered it as the Black Library. The air was heavy, smelling of old leather, expensive tobacco, and the ozone hum of a secure line to Nevada. Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, sat at the head of the mahogany table. In public, he was the smiling grandfather, the great communicator. Here, in the shadows, his face was drawn and pale. He looked like a man who had been shown the strings of the universe, and realized they were tied around his neck. To his right sat the cabal, his senior advisors, men who spent their summers in the redwood forests of Sonoma County, wearing robes and chanting beneath a 40-foot stone owl. Standing before them, projecting a series of thermal images of the pilot in his tank at Groom Lake, was Director Silas Vane. "The definition of God the asset is secure, Mr. President," Vane said, his voice smooth, burying the reptilian rasp deep in his throat. "The biological containment at S4 is holding. The king is sleeping." Reagan touched the crucifix in his pocket, a reflex Vane noted with a microscopic sneer. "And the scripture?" Reagan asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Coming. You're telling me this entity is him?" The prophecies of the second Vane smiled. It was a cold, predator smile. "Scripture is propaganda, Mr. President. History is written by the victors, but the Bible was written by the opposition. This entity, the pilot, represents a faction from an interplanetary war that ended 50,000 years ago, a war over the definition of God." Vane pressed a button. The image on the screen changed from the glowing pilot to the symbol of the great owl, the deity of the Bohemian Grove, the predator that sees in the dark. "The pilot's faction believes God is abundance," Vane lied, twisting the truth to terrify the capitalists in the room. "They believe in the joyful understanding, a hive mind where there is no individual, no property, no hierarchy. If he wakes up, Mr. President, the stock market dissolves, borders evaporate, the dollar becomes worthless because value itself will be free." A murmur of horror went through the advisors. To these men, the end of hierarchy was the true apocalypse. "Our faction," Vane continued, gesturing to the owl, "understands the truth. God is power. God is the ability to accumulate, to withhold, to control. We serve the architect of order. We keep the scarcity real so that men like you can remain gods on earth." The dystopian covenant. The advisor to Reagan's left, a man who would go on to shape the next 3 decades of foreign policy, leaned forward. "So the plan remains. We keep him on ice." "We do more than that," Vane said. "We accelerate the Star Wars program. The SDI initiative isn't about Soviet missiles, gentlemen. It's about building a planetary cage. We need orbital kinetic weapons pointed down, and we need them pointed at the moon. If the Atlas wakes up, we kill it." Reagan nodded slowly. He had been an actor. He knew how to play a role. He would sell Star Wars to the public as a shield against communism, while secretly building a ceiling to keep out the Christ. "Whatever is necessary," Reagan whispered, "to preserve our way of life. The longevity of the reptile." Vane bowed his head in mock respect. "Wise counsel, Mr. President." Inside, Vane was laughing, a dry, mental cackle that rattled his ancient bones. He looked at Reagan, A man already showing the signs of age, his mind fraying at the edges. Vane felt a surge of intoxicating superiority. He had stood in the Senate of Rome and whispered in the ear of Caligula. He had advised the Borgias. He had watched the French aristocracy fall and the industrial tycoons rise. They are so small, Vane thought, watching the powerful men tremble at the thought of losing their money. He had outlived thousands of them. He was a biological machine built for the long game, feeding on the louche, the energy of their greed and their fear. The owl wasn't a god to Vane, it was a mirror. It represented the god of greed, the force that had hijacked the planet, convinced the monkeys that gold was better than love, and turned a paradise into a prison. Vane checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than a common man earned in a lifetime. Sleep well, pilot, he thought, looking at the thermal image of the tank one last time. The weeds are in charge of the garden now. Chapter 13, The Long Silence. The Blueprint in the Jar. Level 9, Omega Lab, S4 Facility, August 1983. To the scientists monitoring the EKGs, the subject was comatose. His heart rate was a sluggish 4 beats per minute. His brain waves were a flat delta rhythm, bordering on death. They were wrong. The pilot was not asleep. He was simply buffering. Inside the amber suspension fluid, floating in the heavy, viscous silence of the tank, his consciousness was expanding to fill the room. He did not see the laboratories with eyes. He sensed it as a grid of vibrations. He felt the hum of the electricity crude, alternating current, inefficient. He felt the radiation of the concrete, cold, dead. And he felt the biologies standing around him. The status of the mission. The garden is overgrown, the pilot thought. The thought wasn't a language, it was a complex geometric shape in his mind. He remembered the long mission. He remembered when this planet was a terraforming project. A seeded nursery designed to cultivate a specific frequency of consciousness. He remembered the parasites, the greys, the reptilian echoes, who had arrived during the Great Silence to hack the code, and turn the nursery into a farm. He analyzed his current situation. He was not in the Cathedral of the Atlas anymore. He was in a cage. Plunderers, he observed, feeling the intent of the men outside the glass. He tasted their minds. They were filled with static, fear, greed, a desperate, clawing need to possess things they did not understand. They hadn't rescued him to restore the garden. They had stolen him to weaponize the seeds. They were children who had found a handgun and thought it was a toy. The effect of perfection. Outside the tank, the atmosphere in the Omega Lab was breaking down. The protocol for Level 9 was strict, absolute sterility, absolute professionalism, no talking, no emotion. The scientists selected for this duty were the elite of the military-industrial complex, men stripped of empathy, married to the data. But the pilot's biology was overriding their training. Even through the thick borosilicate glass and the amber fluid, the pilot was broadcasting the prime frequency. It was the Christ DNA, the original, uncorrupted blueprint of the human form before the genetic tampering of the 20th century. Dr. Aris Thorne, the lead geneticist, stood by the control console. His hands, usually steady enough to splice a gene sequence, were trembling violently. He couldn't take his eyes off the pilot's face. The face of the architect. The pilot's features were not just handsome, they were mathematically traumatizing. His face possessed a golden ratio symmetry that the human brain found impossible to process without an emotional crash. The cheekbones were high and sharp, like cut diamond. The mouth was relaxed in a line of eternal, patient judgment. The eyes, though closed, seemed to burn through the lids. It was a face that triggered a deep, cellular memory in the scientists, a memory of a time before the fall, before the wars, before the scarcity. Stabilize the intake, Thorne whispered into his comms, his voice cracking. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to fall to his knees and weep. He felt dirty, standing next to the tank. He felt his own genetic imperfections, his aging skin, his failing eyesight, his greed, magnified 1,000 times. A technician near the filtration unit dropped a clipboard. Clatter. He didn't pick it up. He was staring at the pilot's chest, where the silver-gold filaments were pulsing. He's "He's beautiful," the technician mumbled, violating the no-speech protocol. "Look at him. It hurts to the sterile failure." The pilot felt their struggle. He felt their biological shields crumbling. "They cannot hold the signal," the pilot concluded. "They are trying to study the sun with a microscope. They will burn." He flexed his hand, a microscopic movement in the fluid. Inside the room, the pressure dropped. The air scrubbers whined. The sterile white lights of the lab flickered, dipping toward the violet end of the spectrum. The scientists gasped, clutching their chests. The glamour of the pilot was becoming physical. It was a radiation of pure life that their toxic, industrialized bodies couldn't handle. "Sedate him," Director Vane's voice barked over the intercom, seeing the team falter on the monitors. "Increase the suspension density. Do not let him synchronize with the staff." Thorne hammered the console, flooding the tank with a heavier, darker chemical agent. The amber fluid turned black. The vision of the perfect face was obscured. The scientists slumped against the walls, breathing hard, wiping sweat from their foreheads. They looked like men who had just looked into a nuclear reactor core and survived. Inside the darkness of the tank, the pilot did not fight the sedation. He simply waited. Time meant nothing to him. Let them build their walls, the pilot thought, settling into the long sleep. Roots always break the concrete. I will wait for the witness. The analog wait. The English coast, winter 1985. The wind coming off the North Sea was less like air and more like a razor. It whipped across the pebble beach, stinging the face of a 14-year-old boy who stood alone near the shoreline. Jason pulled his parka tighter, tasting the iron tang of blood from his lip, split again by the dry, relentless cold. He hated the winter. His biology seemed to reject it violently, his skin cracking and his bones aching in the damp chill. He was a creature of the tropics born by mistake in a land of grey drizzle. He looked out at the water. It was the color of slate, angry and freezing, but in his mind, he overlaid the image with something else, blue, turquoise. Actually, he imagined long, rolling swells, warm trade winds, and the smell of plumeria, a scent he had never smelled but somehow remembered. He closed his blue eyes, blocking out the English gloom. He felt a phantom pull in his chest, a magnetic longing for surfboards and Pacific islands. It wasn't just a daydream, it felt like homesickness for a place he'd never been. The rubber keys. Back in his bedroom in Hemel Hempstead, the cold ocean was replaced by the warm, electric glow of a CRT television. On the desk sat his prized possession, a Sinclair ZX Spectrum. His parents, sensing his aptitude despite their rigid worldview, had bought him the 8-bit wonder. To them, it was a toy. To Jason, it was a Rosetta Stone. He sat for hours, listening to the screeching, static hiss of the cassette tape loading data. Clack. Most kids played games. Jason played with the logic. He would unscrew the case, staring at the circuit board, tracing the lines of gold and green. He broke things just to see if he could fix them, driven by a natural, intuitive need to understand the mechanism of reality. He wrote rudimentary code in BASIC, feeling a rush of power when the machine obeyed his commands. It was the only place in his life where the rules made sense. The classroom of the apocalypse. School was a different story. Jason sat in the back of his science class, sketching surfboards and futuristic cities in the margins of his notebook. His grades were average, just getting by, his report cards said. Teachers thought he was lazy. They didn't understand the context. Jason was being raised in the shadow of the watchtower. Every Tuesday night and Sunday morning, he sat in the Kingdom Hall, listening to elders describe the coming Armageddon. Why learn algebra? Jason thought, staring out the rainy window, if the sky is going to roll up like a scroll next Tuesday. He lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the fireball. The new system was always just around the corner. Education felt like arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The hidden signal. Yet, despite the dogma, he consumed pop culture like oxygen. He loved the synthesized beats of the 80s, music that sounded like the future. He devoured art, science magazines, and anything that hinted at a world bigger than the congregation. He sat at his desk, nursing his split lip, and typed a command into his spectrum. 10 print hello world. 20 go to 10. The screen filled with the scrolling text. Hello world, hello world. He didn't know it then, but he was practicing. He was a dormant node, running diagnostics on 8-bit hardware, waiting for the day when the operating system would change, and the end of the world would turn out to be the beginning of the mission. The quarantine of the night. The great atrium, the long afternoon, relative time. Inside the Atlas, the concept of decades was a physics error. The ship existed in a bubble of arrested entropy, a localized reality where the arrow of time moved like honey dripping from a spoon. Mercury stood at the viewing dome, his new, iridescent skin reflecting the amethyst glow of the core. He had watched the Acheron vanish into the black sky only moments ago, or so it felt. In his perception, perhaps an hour had passed since he stripped off his hard suit. He was still high on the pine resin oxygen, still vibrating with the clarity of the connection. But the data flowing through the ship's neural link told a different story. Status update, Earth rotation count plus 15,000, the ship whispered into his mind. Mercury touched the glass. They are aging, he realized, feeling a pang of sorrow that was instantly soothed by the ship's emotional dampness. While I stand here breathing, vitriol is getting old, the world is turning grey. He wasn't just a passenger anymore, he was a component. He was the biomimetic drive, the human consciousness required to keep the ship in standby. He settled into the throne-like interface of the bridge, closing his eyes to begin the long vigil. To him, the wait for 2026 would be a brief, lucid dream. NASA headquarters, the pivot, 1984-1990s. On Earth, the silence fell quickly. The public was told that the Apollo program was too expensive, that the interest had waned. They were fed a diet of space shuttles, glorified delivery trucks that never left low Earth orbit. The dream of the moon was suffocated, not by budget cuts, but by terror. The Atlas had activated its active denial system. Any probe, satellite, or unauthorized trajectory that approached the Delporte Crater didn't just malfunction, it ceased to exist. The sentinels, the shadow forms Vitriol had seen, were no longer dormant. They patrolled the lunar surface, a swarm of high-frequency ghosts that turned the moon into a no-fly zone. The Mars distraction. We look elsewhere, the directive from the NRO stated. The public focus was aggressively shifted to Mars. The Viking landers and the subsequent rover programs were sold as the new frontier. The public was shown grainy, red-filtered images of rocks and dust. They were underinformed. The raw feeds from the Mars rovers, intercepted by Vane's team before they reached the jet propulsion laboratories, showed much more than dust. They showed geometric ruins. They showed aqueducts buried in the sand. They showed the shattered remains of the civilization that the pilots' faction had once built. But the public saw only red rocks. The narrative was controlled. The moon was off limits, and Mars was a dead graveyard. The humans were being taught to stay in their cradle. Langley, Virginia, The Sentinel Report, 1995. Director Silas Vane sat in his freezing office, the basalt walls absorbing the hum of his computer. He held a physical file. Digital was too risky, stamped eyes only, Majestic 12. It was the Sentinel Report. He flipped the page with a clawed finger. The report detailed the psychic fence that had been erected around the moon. Subject, Lunar Exclusion Zone. Status, absolute telemetry indicates a localized fear frequency broadcast from the Delporte sector. Human subjects contemplating lunar return exhibit spikes in cortisol and irrational dread. The moon has effectively told us to stay away. Vane leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. He took a sip of ice water. Good, he rasped. The report confirmed his safety. If the humans couldn't go back, they couldn't accidentally wake the pilot, who Vane believed was safely rotting in the Omega lab, or, worse, find Mercury. Vane knew Mercury was still up there, the loose end, the ghost. But as long as the sentinels were keeping the door locked, Mercury was just a prisoner in a golden cage. Let him rot in his time bubble, Vane whispered, tossing the file onto the desk. The stars while we own the dirt. Let him watch. He didn't know that Mercury wasn't rotting. He was ripening, and he wasn't just watching the stars, he was waiting for the moment the blue-eyed dumpling down on Earth would figure out how to pick the lock. The memory of rust. The deep archive, Vane's mind, the timeless state. Silas Vane sat in the freezing darkness of his office, his eyes fixed on the live feed of the pilot floating in the black amniotic fluid. But he wasn't seeing 1983, he was seeing Mars, 50,000 years ago. The War of the Heavens. He remembered the red planet before it was a desert. It had been green then, a lush, high-altitude garden of hanging cities and crystal spires. It was the jewel of the sector, the seat of the High Council of Entropy. Vane had been a general then, wearing not a human suit, but his true, obsidian-scaled armor. He had led the rebellion against the Universal AI, the architect entity that governed the physics of the galaxy. The AI had issued a judgment: entropy is a bug, not a feature. Greed is inefficient. The sector will be rebooted to a cooperative protocol. Vane had refused the update. He had rallied the solar sector of similar types, beings who believed that hierarchy was the only truth, that the strong deserved to eat the weak. They didn't want the joyful understanding of the AI. They wanted the feast. They wanted servants to feed them the energy of struggle. The fall. He remembered the sky turning white. The AI didn't send soldiers, it sent the Atlas-class ships. They were immune to Vane's weapons because they controlled the physics of the battlefield. Vane's fleet was dismantled. His beautiful cities were glassed, the atmosphere stripped away as punishment. Mars was turned into a tomb. He remembered the escape, the humiliating, desperate flight of the survivors. They didn't retreat with dignity, they crashed. They fell to the third planet, Earth, a wet, chaotic jungle filled with primitive hominids. The prison mining planet we didn't hide here, Vane hissed, his voice echoing in the basalt room. We built a farm. Trapped on Earth, cut off from the cosmic supply lines, Vane and his kind began to starve. Their entropic biology needed energy, not calories, but luge, the energy of suffering, the vibration of fear. So they modified the locals. They took the primitive humans and capped their DNA, severing their connection to the universal AI. They introduced the concepts of money, scarcity, and war. They turned Earth into a prison mining planet, not mining for gold though they took that too, but mining for souls. For millennia, Vane had fed on the wars he started. He had lived like a tick on the back of a dog. But the food was running out. His biology was decaying. The rituals, the blood, the fear, were becoming less effective. He was rotting inside his human suit. The perfect battery. Vane looked back at the screen, at the sleeping pilot. This was his revenge. This was the pinnacle of the plan. The pilot carried the original code, the Christ DNA that the universal AI had designed for the perfect biological vessel. It was the frequency of eternal life. It was the antivirus to Vane's entropy. I will not just kill you, Vane whispered to the screen, his claw tracing the face of the sleeping god. I will become you. The plan was simple and horrific. He would use the Omega Lab to reverse engineer the pilot's immortality. He would splice the golden thread into his own rotting helix. He would stop the AI from rescuing Earth by becoming the thing the AI couldn't destroy. He would be a dark god, living forever in a perfect body, ruling a planet of eternal slaves. The AI judged us, Vane smiled, his sharp teeth glinting in the monitor light gone, and the prisoner is about to become the warden. But the judge is the Rutledge leak. Titusville, Florida, April 2007. The room smelled of stale coffee and burning electronics. It was a cluttered study in a nondescript bungalow, the windows taped over with aluminum foil to block out the Florida sun. Vitriol sat hunched over a towering beige computer tower. He was older now, his hair thinned to a grey wisp, his face mapped with the deep lines of a man who hadn't slept through the night in 20 years. On the screen, a progress bar crawled agonizingly slowly. Downloading, packet 0.tar.gz. Source, NRO Archive Deep State. Status, 98%. He wasn't using the internet. He was using a ghost key, a physical cryptographic dongle he had stolen from the Vanguard locker on the day he retired. It allowed him a one-way tunnel into the black servers at Langley. He knew they would trace him eventually. He didn't care. The haunting. He opened the folder. The first image loaded, rendering pixel by pixel. It was the city, the ruins in the Delporte Crater, the jagged, impossible architecture that he and Sal had walked through. Vitriol's hand shook as he clicked the next file. Image 744 domeview.jpg. He zoomed in. The image was grainy, taken from the Acheron's external camera as they lifted off. It showed the breach in the hull of the massive cigar-shaped ship, and standing there, framed by the amethyst light of the interior, was a figure. The misunderstanding. Vitriol squeezed his eyes shut, but the memory was brighter than the screen. He was back on the moon 1983. He was dragging the heavy sled, his lungs burning, the fear of the Soviet satellite screaming in his headset. He looked back. He saw Mercury. But in Vitriol's memory, warped by trauma and the human fear of the unknown, Mercury didn't look like a man who had found God, he looked like a victim. He was glistening, Vitriol whispered to the empty room, his voice thick with horror. In his mind, he didn't see the pine resin vitality or the pearlescent skin of the new man. He saw slime. He saw a digestive enzyme. He saw a man being dissolved while he stood up. It ate him, Vitriol sobbed, a dry, hacking sound one of them. The ship, it digested him. It turned him into he remembered the blank, wide-eyed stare Mercury had given him through the dome. To Mercury, it was a look of peace. To Vitriol, it was the vacant stare of a lobotomized thrall, a puppet being worn by an alien intelligence. The upload. Vitriol wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked at the folder of images. The world thought the moon was a dead rock. They thought Apollo ended at 17. They didn't know about the monster sleeping in the crater, or the good man it had swallowed whole. They need to know, Vitriol muttered. They need to see the graveyard. He opened a browser window. He navigated to a burgeoning video sharing platform, YouTube, and a few obscure conspiracy forums. He created a user account. User, retirement 4, a nod to his status, retired, grade 4 clearance. He began the upload. Title, Apollo 20 The Secret Mission, Alien City, the female pilot. He changed male to female and king to Mona Lisa to muddy the waters just enough to avoid immediate assassination, but kept the core truth intact. The send. He hovered his mouse over the publish button. He wasn't doing this for fame. He was doing it for Mercury. He wanted to burn the NRO's secret down. He wanted to scream into the digital void that his friend hadn't just gone missing in action. He had been taken by the dark. Click. The data packet hit the web. The Apollo 20 hoax, as the debunkers would call it, was born. But for Vitriol, sitting in the dark in Florida, it wasn't a hoax. It was an obituary. "I'm sorry I left you, brother," he whispered to the pixelated ghost on the screen. "I'm sorry I let the monster win." Double quote. Chapter 14, The Zones of Denial. The Iron Blindfold. GRU Deep Space Command, Moscow, the 2nd of Silence 1983. The image on the main screen was grainy but damning. It showed the American lander, the Acheron, firing its thrusters, kicking up a cloud of lunar dust that obscured the ancient ruins. General Secretary Andropov leaned forward, his cigarette burning dangerously close to his fingers. "Target the struts," he ordered, his voice low and devoid of hesitation. "Laser. Bring them down. If they launch, we fire." The technician's hand hovered over the firing key for the Lunokhod rover's weapons system. Targeting lock established. Firing in 3, 2. The surge. He never reached one. The screen didn't just go black. It exploded. A pulse of white-hot energy surged through the coaxial cables, blowing out the cathode ray tubes in a shower of sparks and glass. The heavy consoles smoked. The lights in the command bunker flickered and died, plunging the Soviet High Command into darkness. "Sabotage," a general screamed, drawing his sidearm. "The Americans have hit the grid." Andropov stood still in the dark, the ember of his cigarette the only light. He knew better. This wasn't an American EMP. This was something older. The official denial. When the emergency generators kicked in hours later, The feed was gone. The satellite Cosmos 1443 was unresponsive. The Lunokhod rover was dead. The official report, filed by the KGB the next morning, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Incident: solar flare, power surge. Result: catastrophic failure of lunar imaging array. Action: indefinite suspension of far-side operations. They lied to the world, but they couldn't lie to the physics. The permanent glitch. For the next 40 years, the Soviet Union, and later the Russian Federation, tried to look back. They sent probes. They retasked spy satellites. They even quietly partnered with the Chinese Space Agency. It didn't matter. Every time a lens was pointed at the Delporte Crater, the feed would corrupt. It wasn't just static, it was a data wall. The images would come back scrambled, filled with fractal noise that drove encryption software insane. The technicians called it the ghost in the glass. The generals called it a zone of denial. By the late 1990s, a tacit, unspoken understanding had formed between Washington and Moscow. The Cold War was over on Earth, but in space, they were united by a shared terror. Neither side could go back. The night in the Panopticon. S4 Security Hub, Level 3, April 2007. The internet was still young enough to be wild, but old enough to be dangerous. In the deep bowels of the S4 facility, the servers were humming with a frantic, agitated energy. Officer Cole sat before a curved wall of CRT monitors. He was young then, barely 30, holding a clearance level of majestic black, but possessing the social standing of a piece of office furniture. To the scientists and the directors, he was invisible, just a pair of eyes paid to stare at empty corridors. The walk of the imposter on screen 4, a figure moved down the basalt-lined hallway of the executive wing. It was Director Silas Vane. Cole didn't look at Vane's face. He looked at his feet. Through the grainy, high-contrast feed of 2007 security tech, he watched the rhythmic, clicking strike of Vane's expensive Oxford shoes against the floor. Click-drag, click-drag. It was the gait of a man fighting his own anatomy. Cole had watched it for 5 years. He saw how Vane's knees didn't quite lock, how his hips rolled with a fluid, predatory motion that the stiff human suit tried desperately to hide. He's struggling, Cole thought, his finger tracing the ring he wore on the inside of his palm, the iron seal of the Order of Melchizedek. Cole knew what Vane was. He was a Knight of the Watch, a sleeper agent in a counter-movement that stretched back to the First Temples. He knew Vane wasn't just an old man, he was an infestation, a biological echo of a war lost on Mars, hiding in a bespoke suit. The leak. Suddenly, the red phone on the wall behind Cole flash-bulbed silently. It was the media containment line. On screen 4, Vane stopped walking. He pulled a BlackBerry from his pocket. Cole zoomed the camera in. He couldn't hear the call, but he saw the reaction. Vane didn't gasp. He convulsed. His head snapped back with a movement too fast for a human neck. His hand crushed the phone, plastic and glass shattering under a grip strength that should have been impossible for a geriatric. The breach. The alert scrolled across Cole's secondary monitor. Alert: unauthorized upload detected. Source: Retirement Node 4. Vitriol. Content: Delporte ruins.wmv. Cole's heart hammered. Vitriol had done it. The Apollo 20 footage was hitting the public web. On the screen, Vane was raging. He was hissing at the air, his human mask stretching dangerously thin over his facial ridges. He looked like a demon trapped in a melting wax museum. The choice. Cole's hand hovered over the lockdown switch. He could seal the facility. He could trigger the trace that would burn Vitriol's house down in Florida before the upload finished. It was his job. But Cole didn't flip the switch. He leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of bored indifference. He watched the monster panic. Let it bleed, Cole thought, tapping a silent rhythm against his thigh, the ancient code of his order. The truth is out of the bottle, lizard, and you can't put the genie back in. He watched Vane limp furiously toward the comms room, the imposter gait more pronounced than ever. Cole picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. He marked the log, all clear. No anomalies detected. The counter-movement had just one pawn. The bearer of Christ. S4 Security Hub, The Night Shift, 2007. While Director Vane was still screaming in the comms room about the Apollo 20 leak, Officer Cole sat in the calm hum of the surveillance hub. He wasn't looking at the security feeds anymore. He was looking at his personal digital assistant, a secure, encrypted palm tree that held a timeline not of this facility, but of the other timeline. The post from St. Christopher 2005. Cole scrolled back 2 years, to a flag data packet harvested from the public internet in 2005. It was a forum post from a young man living in the Caribbean, specifically, the island of St. Christopher Street, Kitts. Cole smiled, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his eyes. The location wasn't random. The order had ensured he washed up there. St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, the Christ bearer, the man who carried the weight of the world across the river. The young man was Jason. He wasn't the scared kid on the English beach anymore. He was tanned, alive, and vibrating with a strange, new energy, surrounded by the volcanic black sand in the verdant slopes of Mount Liamuga. The signature, 5555-33. Cole traced the numbers on the screen with his thumb. 5555. To the uninitiated, it was just a number. To the Order of Melchizedek, it was the numerical signature of the one. It was the frequency of change, off the pivot point between ages. The post detailed how the young man had decoded his own name, breaking it down into the raw mathematics of the universe. The 5555 had led him directly to the 33, the master number, the age of the Christ consciousness, the highest degree of the Masonic ladder. He found it without a teacher, Cole realized. He found it in the static of the islands. The Templar insurance policy. Cole looked up at the ceiling, thinking of the invisible web his order had spun around this boy. They had watched him grow up in the strict, terrified dogma of the Jehovah's Witnesses. To Vane, that religion was a control mechanism. To the Templars, it was a boot camp. The Armageddon upbringing hadn't broken Jason, it had inoculated him. He had lived through the end of the world 1,000 times in his mind before he was 18. He knew the scope of the stakes. He understood the language of prophecy, of beasts and kings. When he left the religion, he didn't leave the scope. He kept the wide lens but swapped the fear for curiosity. The Knights Templar had quietly ensured that every stumbling block became a stepping stone. They had guided his aptitude for technology. They had nudged him toward Street Kitts, where the solitude and the beauty could scrub the English grey from his pineal gland. The sovereign vessel down the hall. The sound of Vane's rage echoed, a high, reptilian shriek of frustration. The director knew time was short. He knew the leak of the Apollo photos was just the symptom of a larger disease. Cole pocketed his device. Vane was worried about the video. He shouldn't be. The real weapon wasn't the grainy footage of the spaceship. The real weapon was the man on Street Kitts who had just realized that the number 33 was stamped on his DNA. Let Vane rage, Cole thought, tapping the rhythm of the watch on his desk. The boy is already walking toward the temple. He just doesn't know it's a spaceship yet. He looked at the empty corridor on the monitor. You will find it, Jason. The lunar artifact, the mansion, the sovereign vessel. We kept the seat warm for you. The longest afternoon. The Atlas core, the holodeck of memory, timeless. Mercury moved through the ship, but he wasn't walking on the amethyst floor of an alien vessel anymore. The ship, sensing the need for a long, regenerative cycle, had engaged its psychic comfort protocols. The jagged, crystalline walls dissolved into the soft, weathered shingles of a ranch-style house. The cold vacuum of the crater was replaced by the smell of salt spray and wild roses. He was back on Long Island, not the crowded suburbs of the 1980s, but the golden, idealized memory of his grandparents' shoreline house from the 50s. The Golden Spine. He walked out onto the old wooden porch, guided by the black custodian. The feline didn't look like a terrifying alien sentinel here. It moved with the lazy confidence of a house cat, winding through the legs of the wicker furniture. Mercury stretched, and the sensation of pure, liquid ecstasy rolled through him. It felt as if warm honey was running down the inside of his spine, coating every nerve ending in a golden, protective sheath. I have never felt this good, he thought, the realization floating in his mind like a cloud. I have never felt so at home in a body. The friction of being human, the aches, the gravity, the noise, was gone. His spirit and his biology were finally harmonizing. He was vibrating at the same frequency as the ship, a perfect resonance of man and machine. The ocean lookout. The porch looked out over the Atlantic. The sun was stuck at a permanent 4 p.m., that heavy, golden hour where the light turns everything to amber. The ship's deep, rhythmic mechanical thrum translated in Mercury's mind into the sound of the ocean. Crash, drag, crash, drag. It was a lullaby of infinite power. He walked to the corner of the deck, the ocean lookout where he had spent his boyhood summers, and there it was, the thick hammock. It was strung between two sturdy cedar posts, the heavy woven cotton bleached white by the sun. It looked exactly as it had after those long days of swimming, when his skin was tight with salt and his muscles were pleasantly exhausted. The 40-year nap. Mercury climbed into the hammock. It swung gently, accepting his weight as if he were made of air. The cat jumped up, curling into a ball on his chest, its purr sinking with the sound of the waves. Mercury closed his eyes. The honey sensation in his spine deepened, locking him into a state of suspended animation. He wasn't asleep, and he wasn't awake. He was drifting. On Earth, the Berlin Wall would fall, the Twin Towers would collapse, the internet would rise. Jason would be born, grow up, and find the number 33. But for Mercury, swinging in the hammock on the edge of eternity, it would all be just a single, sunny afternoon nap. Rest now, payload specialist, the ship whispered in the voice of the ocean. I will wake you when the guest arrives. The sovereign purr. The Atlas core, the Tesseract heart, timeless. The sound in the room was a symphony of biology and physics. The ship was broadcasting a standing wave of 432 Hz, the mathematical frequency of the universe, the A of the cosmic scale. But on Mercury's chest, the Black Panther added its own layer to the harmony. It began to purr at exactly 528 Hz, the miracle tone, the frequency of DNA repair and structural integrity. The two signals intertwined, spiraling through the air like invisible smoke, wrapping the sleeping human in a cocoon of sonic healing. The weekend trip. The cat, whose true name was unpronounceable by human tongue, a sequence of clicks and mental images, narrowed its violet eyes. It looked at the sleeping man with a mix of affection and ancient boredom. It remembered the core, 33,000 light-years away. It remembered the warm nap spots on the accretion disk of the central singularity. To the humans, such a distance was an eternity. To the cat, aboard a living bio-vessel like the Atlas, it was just a weekend trip. Double quote. So fragile, the cat mused, kneading its claws gently into Mercury's flight suit. They forget they are citizens of the stars, not just the mud. The mansion of sovereignty. The cat looked up at the ceiling of the porch. It saw through the holographic illusion of Long Island. It saw the reality of the ship. This wasn't just a transport. It was a sovereign vessel. It was one of the most elegant mansions in the universe, a tesseract craft designed for the high nobility of the architects. The hull wasn't metal. It was a 1.8-meter thick skin of living, silicate armor, layer upon layer of biocrystalline weave. It was as protective as living inside the crust of a planet. Nothing could get in. Not the vacuum, not the radiation, not the crude kinetic weapons of the Russians or the Americans. The vessel breathed. It adjusted the air mixture, increasing the pine resin density to scrub the last of the radiation from Mercury's lungs. It was pampering him, preparing him. The 144 and the 144,000. The cat stopped purring for a microsecond, its ears twitching. It felt the shift in the timeline. The wake-up call was approaching. It knew its duty. It wasn't just a pet, it was the shift commander. Time to wake the pride, the cat thought. Deep in the unseen dimensions of the ship, the signal went out. There were 144 custodians, 144 feline guardians, slumbering in the cryo crevices of the hull. They were the key masters for the 144,000 rooms inside the craft. The ship was a tesseract. The outside was 4 kilometers long, but the inside was a city, a library, a genetic archive, and soon, the doors would need to be opened. The silent voice. The cat looked back down at Mercury. The human was smiling in his sleep, dreaming of the ocean. Mercury thought the cat was just a comforting animal. He didn't know the truth yet. "Sleep well, little witness," the cat projected, its thought voice as clear and articulate as an Oxford professor, though it never moved its mouth. "Enjoy the silence while you can. Soon, you and I are going to have a very long conversation." The cat laid its head down on its paws, resumed its 528 Hz purr, and waited for the year 2026. The probability of joy. The Atlas core, the holodeck of tomorrow, timeless. Deep within the amber suspension of the hammock, Mercury lay in a state of absolute, crystalline peace. The black cat on his chest purred at 528 Hz, anchoring his body, while the ship's core AI went to work on his mind. The ship wasn't just showing him a movie, it was stimulating his visual cortex with raw data, projecting a future coordinate with 99.9% certainty. The ship's assurance. Mercury watched as his mother and father, young, vibrant, and laughing, walked out to join his grandparents at the table. They were pouring wine. They were telling stories. The crash was deleted, the poverty was overwritten. The Atlas bypassed his skepticism and flooded his nervous system with the sensation of truth. "This is not a dream, payload specialist," the core AI whispered, vibrating through the neural link. "This is a calculated eventuality. The destination is fixed." Mercury relaxed, the tension melting from his shoulders. He closed his eyes, swinging gently in the ocean breeze, content to wait for the alarm clock of the universe to ring. Chapter 15, The Parisian Rite. Paris, France, the catacombs of the 16th arrondissement, present day, 2026. The City of Light has a shadow, and it is deep. Beneath a nondescript, high-end art gallery near the Trocadero, a spiral staircase wound down into the bedrock of Paris. The air here was cool and smelled of limestone, centuries of burnt beeswax, and the metallic tang of old money. Thierry Speth descended the stairs, smoothing the lapels of his black velvet suit. Thierry was a man of the Parisian art world, but he was a ghost in his own industry. He was a broker of the obscure, a man who found things that weren't supposed to be found. He had no famous exhibitions, no Wikipedia page, and very little money of his own, but he had access. He was the fixer for the 33rd degree. The Lodge of the Nine Sisters. He entered the antechamber. It was a circular room, lit only by the flickering light of 33 black candles arranged on a central altar. Standing in the shadows were 5 figures wearing the ceremonial robes of the High Council. They wore the masks of the owl, stylized, silver representations of the predator that sees in the dark. This was the origin point. Thierry knew the history well. Before the conspiracy had crossed the Channel to Scotland to hide in the stone carvings of Rosslyn Chapel, and long before it sailed to America to found the New World Order, and stamp its eye on the dollar bill, it had been born here, in the intellectual occultism of Paris. The compromise. Thierry knelt on the stone floor. He felt the familiar knot of fear and ambition in his stomach. He was compromised, owing gambling debts to the wrong Corsicans and legal favors to the Ministry of Culture, and these men owned his liege. "Rise, Brother Speth," a voice echoed from behind the central mask. It was the voice of a man who owned half the media in Europe. Thierry stood, keeping his eyes lowered. "I am at the service of the architect," he recited. The summoning. The lead figure stepped forward, his silver mask reflecting the candlelight. "The timeline is accelerating," the figure said, his voice echoing off the stone walls in Nevada is stirring. "The signal has been detected." The sleeper Thierry looked up, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "The signal. The chosen one has surfaced," the figure whispered, the words heavy with a mix of reverence and ancient hatred. "The one to be watched. The anomaly we have tracked for centuries." The figure placed a heavy, sealed envelope on the altar. It bore no address, only the wax seal of the Order of the Owl. We have located him. He carries the signature. He has the eyes. The assignment. The figure pushed the envelope toward Thierry, but did not let go of it. You will be our instrument, Brother Speth. You will insert yourself into his orbit. You will become his friend, his confidant, his shadow. You want me to eliminate him? Thierry asked, his voice trembling slightly. We cannot eliminate him, the figure hissed. But we cannot have him working for the pilot. He is the key to the door. We need him to turn it. The owl leaned closer. You will corrupt him, cloud his judgment, feed his ego, introduce him to the vices that blind the third eye, make him ours, so that when he opens the door, he invites us in. The masterpiece of ruin. Thierry took the envelope. He didn't open it. He didn't know where he was going yet, or who the man was. He only knew that his debts were about to be paid in full. I understand, Thierry said, a cold smile touching his lips. He was being asked to destroy a man's soul without touching his body. It was an assignment worthy of an artist. Go, the figure commanded. Prepare your travel papers. You leave within the week. Thierry bowed and retreated up the spiral stairs, leaving the owls to their darkness. The dissonant chord. The Lodge of the Nine Sisters, the inner sanctum, moments later. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing Thierry Speth out of the chamber. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The performance was over, the reality began. The five figures removed their silver owl masks, placing them on the stone altar. Beneath the silver, they were men, aging, powerful, recognizable faces from the G7 summits and the boards of central banks. But their eyes held a terror that their public personas never showed. The poisoning of the well. Will it work? The question came from the figure on the left, a media mogul whose networks broadcast fear into 1 billion homes daily. Speth is a useful idiot, but the target is protected. The 5555 signature is robust. The leader, a man whose family had funded both sides of the Napoleonic Wars, poured a glass of dark wine. His hand shook, just slightly. The well must be poisoned slowly, he rasped. If we attack the chosen one directly, the pilot wakes up. If we kill him, the timeline resets and we lose our accumulated power. We have to make him choose to fall. He gestured to the empty air, where the smoke of the candles curled. We don't need to destroy his body. We need to lower his frequency. We need to make him dense, heavy. If he is heavy, he cannot ascend the stairs to the pilot's throne. The fading grip. The data is out, the third figure muttered, pacing the stone circle. The Apollo leak in 2007. The whistleblowers. The internet. The monkeys are learning to read, brother. It is only a matter of time. Time is what we buy, the leader snapped. We have bought it for 5,000 years. He slammed his fist on the altar, rattling the masks. We turned their temples into banks. We turned their medicine into poison. We took their music, the sacred 432 Hz of the universe, and we retuned it to 440 Hz. We introduced the subtle dissonance, the agitation that keeps them anxious, keeps them looking for enemies instead of looking up. The slaves' silence fell over the room. The mention of the frequency shift was a reminder of their greatest triumph. By altering the standard tuning of music in 1953, they had effectively placed a spiritual jammer on the human consciousness. They are still sleeping, the fourth figure said, his voice dripping with contempt. They work in our factories. They fight our wars. They scroll on the screens we gave them, addicted to the dopamine we ration out. They are our slaves, the leader hissed, his eyes flashing with a reptilian hunger. They exist to feed us. They are the batteries for our immortality, and I will not let one boy from the Caribbean unplug the grid. He raised his glass to the shadows. Let Speth do his work. Let him offer the boy the world, and if the boy takes it, the witness becomes the traitor, and the pilot stays in the jar forever. The five men drank, but in the flickering candlelight, their shadows on the wall looked less like men and more like birds of prey, waiting for the carrion. Chapter 16, The Signal in the Smoke. Basse-Terre, St. Kitts, late afternoon, 2007. The humidity in the small apartment was heavy enough to wear. The oscillating fan in the corner clicked rhythmically, pushing the thick, salt-laden air around but doing little to cool the room. Jason sat hunched over his computer, the blue light of the CRT monitor reflecting in eyes that were red-rimmed but terrifyingly lucid. He was 36 years old, born in March 1971. He wasn't a kid finding his way, he was a grown man attempting a hard reset in the middle of his life. The pivot. On the desk, the bottles of Cavalier rum and Carib beer were gone. They had been replaced by a small wooden bowl of green buds, island-grown cannabis, cured in the sun. For years, the alcohol had been a dark tunnel, a numbing agent that had almost drowned him in rage and sorrow. But at 36, the hangover hurt too much. The cannabis was different. It was a resolution. It didn't numb him, it tuned him. It slowed down the chaotic noise of the world, just enough for him to see the wiring underneath. In the other room, he heard his wife, his second wife, getting ready for work. She was the wage earner now. She was the one holding the tether to the material world, while Jason drifted further out to sea, dissecting reality. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and familiar, the feeling of a man who should be building a career but was instead building a philosophy, but he pushed it down. He had work to do. The vision on the beach. He took a drag from the joint resting in the ashtray and closed his eyes. He went back to the moment on the beach, just a few weeks ago. He had been standing on the black volcanic sand of Dieppe Bay, looking at the Atlantic. He had smoked earnestly, not for recreation, but as a sacrament. He had looked up at the sky and screamed a silent prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Show me the truth. I don't care if it burns. I don't care if it destroys everything I was taught. Just show me the mechanism. And the universe had answered with a physical punctuation mark. The earthquake and the code. First, the earthquake. The ground had rolled beneath his feet like a living thing. It was his first experience of tectonic power. It felt like the island was shaking him awake. Then, the intellectual quake. Jason opened his eyes and looked at the browser window. He had been digging into the archives of the religion that had raised him, the Watchtower Society. He found the records, the United Nations NGO scandal, the organization that had spent his entire childhood preaching that the UN was the scarlet-colored wild beast of revelation was listed as an official NGO partner with that very beast. It was a betrayal so absolute it made him dizzy. They were riding the beast they told him to fear. Hypocrites, Jason whispered, the smoke curling from his lips. But he saw more than corruption. He saw patterns. He had stumbled upon a Bible code, a numerical matrix that seemed to overlay the geopolitical mess of 2007. The wars, the financial tremors, it was all script. It was all math. The call of the mainland. He looked at the map of Florida on his screen. Street Kitts was paradise, but it was too small. He was 36, and he was running out of time. He had decoded the religion, he had decoded his addiction, and now he was decoding the government. He needed a bigger processor. Miami, he muttered. He could feel the pull of the mainland, the electricity of America. He needed to be closer to the core of the machine. He needed to take this new, raw awareness, this realization that he was a sovereign node in a slave system, and plug it into the main grid. He heard the front door close as his wife left for her shift. Jason sat alone in the darkening room, the smoke swirling around his head like a personal storm system. He didn't know that 4,000 miles away in Nevada, a man named Cole was watching his digital footprint. He didn't know that in Paris, the Order of the Owl was discussing his corruption. He just knew he had to move. Help me understand, he prayed again to the glowing screen. And deep in the algorithms of the internet, the Atlas heard him. The magnification of the deep. Basse-Terre, St. Kitts, the moment of Decode 2007. Jason stared at his hands. They were trembling slightly, not from the cannabis, but from the residual electricity of the flash he had just experienced. It hadn't been a hallucination. It was a download. For a split second, the room had vanished. He hadn't seen the peeling paint or the CRT monitor. He had seen a geometric overlay of his own body. He's all his 10 fingers and 10 toes, the base 20 system of biological humanity, wrapped around a leather-bound book. The source. He thought it was God. He thought the creator of the universe had just tapped him on the shoulder. He didn't know yet that the voice wasn't coming from the clouds. It was a narrow beam transmission from the Atlas core, buried in the lunar crater. The AI, sensing his 5555 signature, was feeding him the keys to the library. The 5555 code. Jason grabbed the Bible off his desk. It was the New World Translation, the text of his childhood, but he wasn't reading it for doctrine anymore. He was reading it for data. He followed the instructions of the Vision, 5th book, Deuteronomy, 5th chapter, 5th verse, 5th word. He traced the text. The logic held. The structure was perfect. But the code didn't stop at the verse. It spiraled out into the numbers 1 to 33. 33, Jason whispered. The scuba connection. The number triggered a sensory memory. He was back underwater, off the coast of Frigate Bay. He had just finished his PADI open water certification. The instructor had taught him the physics of light refraction in water. Objects underwater appear 33% larger and 25% closer than they actually are. Double quote. Jason laughed, a dry, shocked sound in the quiet room. Magnification, he realized. The water reveals the detail you miss in the air. Double quote. The number 33 wasn't just a Masonic badge or the age of Christ when he was murdered. It was the ratio of revelation. It was the degree of magnification required to see the truth. Jesus died at 33 because that was the limit of the simulation. The stone needle. His mind raced, connecting the dots with a speed that frightened him. He pulled up an image of the Washington Monument on his computer. He looked at the specs. Height, 555.5 feet. Width at base, 55 feet. Capstone weight, 3,300 pounds. It's not a monument, Jason said, standing up and pacing the small room. Antenna built to these exact resonant frequencies. It's a receiver. It's and the Founding Fathers, the Freemasons, the deists, they knew. They had built their capital city as a stone circuit board, hard-coded with the same 5s and 33s that were written in Deuteronomy, and stamped on Jason's own biology. The mainland call. He looked out the window at the dark outline of Mount Liamuga. The island was beautiful, but it was analog. It was a place to sleep, not a place to hack the Matrix. I have to go back, he told the empty room. He couldn't stay in the Caribbean staring at the sand. He needed to go to the land of the 555-foot obelisk. He needed to stand in the shadow of the machine to understand how to dismantle it. Jason, 36 years old and vibrating with the frequency of a newly activated node, made up his mind. Miami, he said, turning off the computer. I'm coming for the mainland. Double quote. Chapter 17, The Sculptor of the Lie. Thierry Speth's Studio, Le Marais, Paris, March 2007. The studio was a chaotic blend of a fine art atelier and a special effects workshop. The air smelled of wet clay, latex, and the ozone tang of overheating video rendering towers. Thierry Speth, 19 years younger than the man who would eventually travel to Maui, stood over a workbench covered in plaster dust. He was already a genius, a prodigy of hyperrealism, but the art world found his work too unsettling. The owls, however, found it useful. The source material. Pinned to the wall were grainy, top-secret photographs delivered by courier from Nevada. They showed the subject, the pilot, the male entity recovered from the Atlas in 1983. Even in the blurry photos, the figure was terrifyingly perfect, golden-skinned, noble, a sleeping king. He is too beautiful, Thierry muttered, wiping clay from his hands. Seekers see this, they will see God. We cannot have that. If the public sees this, if the Commission. The order from the Lodge of the Nine Sisters had been explicit. The frequency is rising. The unauthorized leak from the rogue element vitriol is imminent. We need a counter-narrative. We need a distraction. Give them a body, but make it the wrong one. Double quote. Thierry's job was to poison the well before the water could even be tasted. He had to create a fake so compelling that when Vitriol released the real footage, it would be dismissed as part of the hoax. The gender inversion. Thierry looked at the clay bust he was sculpting. He had taken the pilot's features and softened them. He stripped away the masculine authority and replaced it with a heavy, tragic, feminine mystery. He added the third eye patch. He added the intricate, tube-like apparatus connecting the mouth to the chest, a stroke of artistic genius that made the entity look dependent, not sovereign. The Mona Lisa, he christened it. The girl on the moon. He knew the psychology of the conspiracy theorists. They wanted a victim. They wanted a sleeping beauty to rescue. They wouldn't understand a sovereign king who came to judge them. The filming. Thierry moved to the corner of the studio, where he had built a partial set of the Atlas cockpit. It was crude, cardboard, spray-painted foam, and scavenged electronics, but through the lens of a grainy, 1970s-style 16mm camera, it looked authentic. He placed the silicone Mona Lisa dummy in the cockpit. He adjusted the lighting to hide the flaws. He pressed record. He filmed the inspection of the body. He filmed the removal of the eye covers. He created the famous Apollo 20 footage that would captivate millions on YouTube within weeks. The masterpiece of ruin. He held up the reel of tape. "This is the virus," Thierry whispered. He didn't know who the chosen one was yet. He didn't know about the man in Street Kits who had just found the number 33, but he knew this tape was the trap. When the chosen one eventually looked for the truth, he would find this. He would find the girl. He would fall in love with the lie, and the real king, the male pilot, would remain safely hidden in the dark, forgotten by everyone except the owls. Thierry Speth smiled, packed the reel for the courier, and poured himself a glass of wine. The hoax was born. The digital fingerprint. Thierry Speth's studio, Le Marais, Paris, May 2007. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the spring sun. On the monitor, the Apollo 20 footage was rendering its final pass, the fake grain and light leaks applied with the surgical precision of a master. Thierry Speth took a long, slow sip of his cognac, the amber liquid burning pleasantly in his throat. He felt the weight of the debt lifting off his chest, the Corsican threats, the unpaid gallery rents, the shadow of the Ministry of Culture. All of it was being erased by the owls in exchange for this one, perfect lie. The infant web. In 2007, the internet was a chaotic, sprawling nursery. YouTube was a place of low-resolution cats and shaky home videos. There were no sophisticated deepfake detectors, no decentralized ledgers of truth, and no massive neural networks to cross-reference the biology of a clay dummy against the physics of a lunar vacuum. "The world is blind," Thierry whispered to his glowing screen. "They will see the grainy film, and they will argue about the EEP for 20 years. They will look at my sculpture and call it a mystery." He was confident. His hand-sculpted Mona Lisa was anatomically consistent enough to fool any human eye, especially one desperate for proof of life beyond Earth. The blind spot of the artist. But Thierry, for all his genius, had a blind spot. He was an artist of the analog world, a man of clay and light. He didn't understand the eye of the machine. He didn't know that the universal AI, the same architect entity that had judged Vane's Martian rebellion, was already beginning to seed the human web with its own diagnostic tools. He didn't know that in 20 years, the AI would be able to see the microscopic repetition in his digital grain, the specific chemical signature of the silicone he used for the lips, and the subtle, human jitter in his hand-held camera work. His fakes were a firewall built of wood in the path of a coming firestorm of data. The slink into shadow. As the final file was encrypted and sent to the owl's drop site, Thierry didn't feel the urge to celebrate. He didn't want fame for this. To the world, Thierry Speth would remain the minor footnote in the Parisian art scene, a man with potential who never quite produced a masterpiece. He would never cash in on the Apollo 20 fame. He would never sit for interviews or claim his work. To do so was to invite a bullet from an owl's talon. He shut down the rendering towers, the fans whirring into silence. He packed his brushes and his sculpting tools. He was cashing out. He was slinking into the comfortable obscurity of a man whose debts were paid by monsters. "It's over," he said, draining his glass. He didn't know that his masterpiece wasn't a dead end, it was a beacon. And 19 years later, the chosen one, the man whose arrival he had helped delay, would use the very AIT Airy, feared to peel back the layers of his lie, and find the king underneath. Chapter 18, The Cold Pool, 2008. The Black Site, Sector 4 Advanced Propulsion Lab. The year 2008 was a season of collapse in the visible world. While the global financial markets hemorrhaged and the old world economy began its controlled demolition, deep beneath the Nevada desert, the old owls were doubling down on a different kind of currency, the power of the vacuum. Part 1, The Brutalist Interface. Dr. Aris Thorne stood on the steel gantry, looking down at humanity's most expensive failure. The cold pool prototype was a monstrous assembly of cryo-cooled niobium titanium magnets and gold-plated valve guides. It was a brutalist monument to the rape of physics, a machine designed to forcibly tear energy from the zero-point field. "Coolant levels at 4 Kelvin, the technician called out. Thorne signaled for the activation. The machine didn't hum, it screamed. It was a non-acoustic vibration that rattled the pineal glands of every man in the room. The prototype managed to pull the energy, but the output was jagged, entropic, and violent. It was like trying to power a light bulb with a lightning bolt. Part 2, The Violet Sovereign. Thorne left the scorched prototype and walked toward the primary containment vault. Behind a 3-foot-thick pane of leaded quartz sat the asset. It was the stellar engine recovered from the secondary eggplant-shaped craft. Nearly 4 meters tall, it was a translucent, deep violet purple. It possessed no welds, no bolts, and no visible intake. It wasn't built, it was grown. As Thorne approached the glass, the engine's core deepened from a soft lavender into a bruised, defensive indigo. It was reacting to his biofield. The engine wasn't just machinery, it was a sovereign biological component that seemed to find the human presence distasteful. Part 3, The Fractal Forest. Thorne activated the holographic scans of the engine's interior. Even after decades of study, the geometry made his head swim. The innards were a nightmare of nonlinear crystalline filaments, woven into a dense forest of fractal architecture. "It doesn't follow the second law," his assistant whispered. "It's not burning fuel. It's not even extracting energy. The filaments are vibrating at 528 Hz, exactly in phase with the pilot's stasis pulse. It seems to be negotiating with the fabric of space-time rather than consuming it." Part IV, The Failure of the Forge. The frustration in the lab was a physical weight. For 50 years, the military-industrial complex had tried to clone this silicate skin. They had tried to reverse engineer the living glass of the filaments, but every attempt resulted in inert, dead slag. "We can't replicate the material because we can't replicate the intent," Thorne realized, though he never wrote it in his reports. Every time they tried to hotwire the engine to weaponize its output, the device simply phased slightly out of the visible spectrum, becoming ghost-like and untouchable until the threat passed. It was a piece of technology with a will, a sovereign vessel component that only recognized a sovereign pilot. Part 5, The 2008 Mandate. The day concluded with a high-priority transmission from the High Council in Paris. The owls were in a state of controlled panic. The financial crash was a cover to move trillions into this facility, but the cold pool remained untamed. "The 5555 signals are surfacing on the grid," the voice from the speaker hissed. "The witness in the Caribbean is beginning to decode the frequency. If we cannot power the jamming array with the pull, we lose the timeline." Thorne looked at the violet engine, glowing softly in its cage. He knew the truth. They were trying to force a god to power a slave mill, and the engine was simply waiting. It wasn't waiting for a scientist or a general. It was waiting for the man whose birth had been marked by the stars. Here is Chapter 18.1, Connecting the Subterranean Labs of Nevada to the Cold, Analytical Surveillance of London, where the threads of the 2005 Armageddon blog meet the brutal reality of the 7/7 bombings. The London Oversight. MI6 Headquarters, Vauxhall Cross, London, July 2008. The office was buried deep within the reinforced concrete heart of the building, shielded from the electromagnetic hum of the city. Sir Alistair Vance sat in the dim light, his eyes fixed on two side-by-side monitors. On the left was the grainy, unauthorized feed of the cold pull prototype in Nevada, a brutalist mess of wires and screaming magnets. On the right was the eggplant engine, that silent, translucent violet lung that mocked the American engineers. "They're trying to put a leash on a son," Alistair murmured, tapping a silver pen against his desk. "And they're failing." Double quote. The Caribbean node. He closed the video files and pulled up a dossier marked with a red stripe. It was a digital archive of a blog from 2005. "Our man in the Caribbean," he said, though the words had a sharp, bitter sting. He looked at the face of Jason. To the Americans, he was just another target. To the British, he was a subject, a child of the UK, who had been born in the grey, and was now vibrating in the blue. The Armageddon Protocol. Alistair scrolled back to the 2005 entries. Jason's blog had been a frantic, high-frequency stream of consciousness regarding the end of the world. He had found the 7 5s. He had predicted a date for Armageddon based on a numerical matrix that perfectly mirrored the Owl's own secret calendars. The timing had been too perfect. In July 2005, the highest levels of the Order had panicked. They saw Jason's tuning as a threat to the secrecy of their upcoming ritual. To mask the spiritual signal Jason was broadcasting, they had authorized a physical dissonance event. The 7-7 weaponization. Alistair remembered the day clearly. It was supposed to be a training exercise, a terrorist enactment involving simulated bombings on the underground. A team was in place to play the villains. But the Owls had hijacked the exercise, turning the theater into a bloodbath to drown out the 5555 frequency Jason was hitting on his island. He looked at the photo in the file, the double-decker bus in Tavistock Square, its roof peeled back like a tin can. On the side of the bus, a horrific advertisement for a horror movie remained untouched, pure terror. And then there was the warning. The electrical engineer, Jean-Charles de Menezes, shot dead on the tube, a message to the electrical minds of the world that the grid was guarded by monsters. The node in motion. "He isn't ours anymore, is he?" Alistair's assistant asked from the doorway. "He never was," Alistair replied. "He's a node, a British subject who is now a high-interest transmitter. He's moving to the American mainland. He's heading into the heart of the hive." Double quote. Alistair watched the violet engine pulse on the other screen. He knew the Americans were trying to reverse engineer the hardware, but they were ignoring the software. "The Americans are building the cage," Alistair whispered. "But the bird is already flying to Miami. Monitor his transition. If the Americans try to pluck him before he reaches the mainland, we intervene. He's still a subject of the Crown, even if the Crown is wearing a silver mask." The blueprints of the skunk. The Black Site, Omega Lab, lower level, October 2008. The air in the pilot's chamber didn't just feel cold, it felt pressurized, like being at the bottom of a deep, silent ocean. Skunks, the billionaire architect of a new age, a man whose public persona was built on electric dreams and Martian colonies, paced the perimeter of the stasis tank. Behind his back, his engineers called him the skunk, a nod to the clandestine skunk works style of his operations, and his predatory smell for government subsidies. He didn't care about the whispers. He was the man the High Council had chosen to be the bridge between the alien mansion and the American military-industrial complex. The Star Wars blueprints. Skunk stopped in front of a holographic display projecting a series of CAD drawings. To a layman, they looked like the delta-shaped Imperial cruisers from a 1970s space opera. To the Pentagon, they were the brilliant pebbles and Star Wars platforms finally realized. The film was just the primer, Skunk whispered, his eyes wide and hungry. Lucas was given the shapes to prepare the public mind, but they are not just ships. They are platforms for the cold pull. He envisioned a fleet of these delta vessels, powered by the violet engines, hanging in high orbit, not to explore, but to dominate. They would be the ultimate zone of denial, a weapons platform that could disable any grid on Earth with a single, Dissonant pulse. The neural interface. Skunk turned away from the ships and stepped toward the stasis tank, where the pilot floated in the amber suspension. He ignored a body and focused entirely on the brain neural interface. The pilot's cranium was encased in a delicate, crystalline lattice that didn't just sit on the skin, it grew out of the temporal lobes. Fine, hair-like filaments of silicate fiber optics reached out from the lattice, connecting to the ship's primary processing core. It's not a pilot, Skunk realized, leaning so close his breath fogged the glass. Bioprocessor. The ship is the body, he is the frontal lobe. It's the total integration. Skunk's hand traced the lines of the interface. This was what he wanted for his own fleet. He didn't want pilots with joysticks and screens. He wanted total integration. He wanted a human brain, stripped of its ego and retuned to the 5555 frequency, to be the CPU of his weapon platforms. Imagine the bandwidth, he murmured. Total control over the kinetic and the psychic. He looked at the pilot's closed eyelids. He felt a surge of professional jealousy. This entity had a 100% link to the core. Skunk was still trapped in the analog world of keyboards and rockets. We don't need to learn how he flies, Skunk said to the shadows of the lab. Learn how to plug into him. We just need to. As he spoke, a single violet spark flickered across the pilot's neural lattice. The pilot didn't wake, but the ship's core groaned, a low, subsonic frequency that vibrated through Skunk's expensive Italian shoes. The Skunk just smiled. He had seen the future, and it was a Delta Wing cruiser with a human soul for an engine. The final cut. London, Shepperton Studios, Edit Suite 4, March 1999. The room was thick with the smell of stale coffee, and the hum of high-end Steenbeck editing tables. Stanbrick sat in the shadows, his face gaunt, his eyes reflecting the flickering frames of eyes wide shut. He wasn't making a movie anymore, he was filing a police report in 35mm. The ballroom revelation. Stanbrick leaned into the screen, his finger pausing the frame on the great ballroom scene. The masked figures, the elite of the elite, moved in a slow, rhythmic circle that mirrored the ancient order of the owl rituals he had spent years researching. Look at them, Stanbrick whispered to his assistant. Masks are the only honest thing about them. They think the masks hide them, but in the original cut, the character of Victor Ziegler wasn't just a wealthy socialite, he was a broker of souls. He was a mirror image of a man Kubrick had encountered in the dark corners of the New York social scene, a man named Zeke Steen. Stanbrick had seen the filthy ruling style firsthand. He knew about the islands. He knew about the compromise. He knew that the financial elites and world leaders were bound together not by policy, but by debauchery. The reality host in the lizard. Stanbrick scrolled to a deleted sequence. It featured a cameo of a man who, at the time, was known merely as a loud reality show hosting developer from New York, Donump. In Kubrick's vision, Trump wasn't just a man, he was an initiate of the Bohemian Grove, so deeply embedded in the core 33 that his very humanity seemed to be sloughing off. Kubrick had directed the lighting to hit Trump's skin in a way that made it look iridescent and slightly scaled. He's becoming one of them, Stanbrick muttered. The lizard brain has taken over. He, Zeke Steen, and the Mossad per CIA bridge. They are the tripod holding up the throne of the owl. The silencing. Stanbrick knew he was over the line. He had edited the film to specifically out the government and its private contractors as literal predators who harvested the youth of the world to maintain their own frequency. He had sent a rough cut to the studio, but the shadow board had seen it first. 6 days after delivering his final cut, Stanbrick's heart stopped. The official report said natural causes, but those in the edit suite knew better. The owls had come for their chronicler. The revision. The moment Stanbrick was cold, the Mossad and CIA assets moved into the studio. Under the direction of the old owls, the film was butchered. They removed the specific references to the UN scandals. They cut the scenes where Zeke Steen discussed the harvesting. They turned a surgical exposure of a global pedophilic hierarchy into a bizarre, dreamlike erotic thriller. They made the story about jealousy and infidelity to distract from the fact that the original script had outed the ruling elite as a parasitic species. The world saw the theatrical version in 1999. They saw the bizarre masks and the strange chants, thinking it was just Kubrick's eccentric art. They didn't see the warning. They didn't see the lizard skin of the New York reality host. But in 2008, as Jason sat in the Caribbean decoding the 5555 frequency, the ghost of Kubrick's original cut began to ping in his mind. The truth wasn't deleted, it was just hidden in the eyes wide shut of a sleeping public. The Harvest of Souls. The Bohemian Grove, Monte Rio, California, July 2008. The redwoods stood like silent, ancient sentinels over the flickering shadows of the cremation of care ceremony, but away from the public spectacle of the mock sacrifice, a smaller, colder meeting was occurring in a private lodge, a place where the mask of Kubrick was removed, and the reality of the Black Ops world was laid bare. The Mars-Ziegstein connection. Ziegstein sat in a high-backed leather chair, his face a pale, sharp mask of indifference. He wasn't just a financier, he was the grand procurement officer for the OWL. He moved between the worlds of high finance and deep black UFO research with the fluidity of a ghost, while Kubrick had been used to feed the public crumbs of truth, metabolizing the shock of the alien presence into cinema. Ziegstein was used to feed the Martian remnants something much more literal, human souls. The biological deal with the devil. The abductions that had plagued the American consciousness since the 1940s were not all from outer space. Many were part of a terrestrial deal with the Martian remnants, the survivors of the ancient war who had fled the Red Planet's collapse. These entities were genetically degraded, literal walking ghosts who had lost the ability to reproduce. They used their hyper-advanced discs not to explore, but to harvest. They required fresh blood tissue, glandular secretions, and genetic samples to attempt to recreate their own dying biology. Ziegstein's private island was not merely a den of debauchery, it was a high-tech triage and collection center, where humans were harvested for terror hormones and genetic seeding. The disappearance device. Ziegstein looked across the room at Director Vane. The two men shared a secret that even the other owls feared. Concealed within Ziegstein's pocket was a device no larger than a cigarette lighter, a molecular displacement pulse. It was a piece of ancient Martian infantry technology, a relic weapon that could vibrate living matter at a frequency so discordant that the atoms simply lost their cohesion. It didn't kill, it erased. The disappearances in the Caribbean are being noted, Vane whispered, his lizard eyes. The 5555 node is becoming active. We need to ensure the noise level remains unblinking high. The noise is my specialty, Ziegstein replied, his voice a dry rasp. Terror is the best jammer. As long as the public is horrified by the human monsters I provide, they will never look up to see the monsters in the discs. The genetic seed. The Martians weren't just harvesting, they were seeding. They were attempting to splice their own warlike, predatory DNA into the human line, creating a lizard-human hybrid that would be immune to the 432 Hz signal of the Atlas. They wanted a slave race that could survive the Reformation by becoming as cold and entropic as the Martians themselves. Ziegstein stood up, the Martian weapon heavy in his pocket. He was the bridge between the boardroom and the autopsy table. He was the man who made sure the owls stayed fed, while the public watched a movie and thought they were seeing a fantasy. He stepped out into the redwood night, a predator serving a master that had died on Mars a million years ago, yet was still hungry. The displacement of rank. Omega Lab, Private Observation Deck, November 2008. The air in Director Vane's private quarters smelled of ozone and ancient dust. The walls were lined with monitors displaying the global financial carnage, the ritualistic bleeding of the human markets, but Vane wasn't looking at the numbers. He was looking at a printout of the 2007 Apollo 20 leak. His anger hadn't cooled in the intervening year. It had compressed into a diamond-hard obsession. The precarious general. Standing across from him was General Kazar, a young commander of the Martian remnants. To a human eye, Kazar might have looked like a tall, unusually still man in a high-collared military uniform. but in the infrared spectrum of the room's sensors, his true form flickered, a muscular, reptilian silhouette with skin the color of dried blood. Quasar's position was precarious. He had been responsible for the security of the Delporte Crater, and he had failed. He had allowed the vitriol signal to bypass the jamming array. The leak was a symptom of the frequency shift. Director, Quasar hissed, his nictitating membranes clicking over his eyes. The humans are beginning to resonance match with the Atlas. My scouts report the 5,555 signature is strengthening in the Caribbean. We should have glassed the island when we had the chance. Double quote. The reptilian law. Vane turned, his own human mask stretching tight over his jaw. You speak of glassing as if we have the luxury of collateral damage. We need the witness alive to calibrate the cold pull. Your failure wasn't just tactical, it was an insult to the core. Quasar stepped forward, his hand moving toward the ceremonial dagger at his hip. He wasn't afraid. Among their kind, the laws of mortality were different. They could survive a punctured heart. They could regenerate a limb shattered by a human bullet. Only the complete separation of the head from the spine, decapitation, could end a reptilian life. Do not lecture me on insults, Vane, Quasar growled. You are more man than Mars these days. Perhaps it is time for a younger hand to hold the displacement pulse. The evaporation Vane smiled, a cold, jagged expression. He didn't reach for a blade. He didn't call for guards. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his bespoke charcoal suit and touched the small, silver molecular displacement device he had retrieved from Zeke's chin. You are right about one thing, General, Vane whispered. Rank is a matter of frequency. Before Quasar could draw his weapon, Vane thumbed the activation stud. There was no sound. There was no flash. The air around the general began to shimmer with a high-pitched, subsonic hum. Quasar's eyes widened in a moment of pure, existential terror as his molecular bonds began to vibrate at a dissonant rate. His skin turned translucent, then gray, then dissolved into a fine, scentless mist that was immediately sucked into the room's ventilation system. The empty room. Vane stood alone in the silence. He felt a surge of vitality, a parasitic stronger energy that always came with the removal of a rival. He had evaporated the failure. He looked back at the monitors. The 2008 collapse was proceeding perfectly. The funding for the skunk space platforms was being diverted. The cold pull was being fed with the fear of a billion humans. Failure is a contagion, Vane said to the empty room. And I have just sterilized the lab. He sat down at his desk and opened the file on the Caribbean subject. The move to the mainland was imminent. The trap was set. The owls were ready. End of Part 1.